morning and welcome, everyone. My name is Lindsay Schaefer. I am the co-chair for the Denton Watch Coalition. Thank you so much for joining us for our wellness workshop this morning and for taking the time to log in when you came into Zoom this morning. This is how we're able to capture our attendance. We will begin in just a few minutes. After you sign in, you can choose to update your display name. And the easiest way to do that is by hovering over your picture in the box and going to the three dots by your name. And then if you go down that drop-down menu, there's a change your name option, rename option there, if you'd like to do that. You can type in your first and last name and the organization you're with, if you choose to rename. In order to help network, please feel free to share your name and the organization you're with and the primary population that you serve in the chat box. Our speakers would love to see you, but a video is certainly not required. Please feel free to use the Q&A option to ask any questions and then continue networking in the chat box. We are so glad that you are all here this morning, and we are going to go ahead and get started. Please be aware that this session will be recorded and made available through the website and social media links to inform and educate the public on this topic. Throughout today's program, our speakers may ask you to unmute and answer or ask questions. Please use the raise your hand feature and we can unmute you to be able to ask your question. Keeping that in mind, if you choose to participate in an identifiable way, you acknowledge that your image and or name will be recorded and are authorizing the use of your information in the recording as described. You have no obligation to appear or speak in the recording. You can turn off your video and participate under an alias should you wish to remain anonymous. The recording of today's workshop is protected by copyright law and is not to be copied. If you feel comfortable doing so on your video at this time, please turn on your video at this time if you feel comfortable doing so. Welcome on behalf of the Wellness Alliance for Total Children's Health here in Denton County. Wellness Alliance for Total Children's Health is also known as WATCH. I am Lindsay Schaefer. I am the Chief Development Officer at Communities and Schools of North Texas. I'm so excited to have you this morning. It is our goal to work together to organize opportunities for professionals and community members to learn about specific topics related to children's mental health and to learn the resources available in our community. We have many people to thank for working collaboratively to put this event together. Members of the Watch Coalition for planning and thinking through this program. Cook Children's for providing CEUs, and you, if you've attended our previous events, for providing feedback. We plan this program with you in mind. We'd also like to thank each of our speakers for giving their time and sharing their expertise with us today. With their permission, we will post the slides and video from today on the Center for Community Health website. We have a few housekeeping details to share this morning as well. I will be hosting the workshop this morning along with the amazing Rebecca DePeo-Christner, who is a Watch Education co-chair. We invite you to engage with the speakers and other attendees in the chat box. You can talk with the group as a whole or one by clicking on the little button next to the to field in the chat feature. This is located just above where you type your message. Today, we will be discussing anxiety, cultivating support strategies for children and youth. Our agenda will cover a quick orientation to the Watch Coalition, and then from 9:15 until 10 o'clock, Kelly Garcia from Soleil Counseling Center will discuss current trends in anxiety. From 10:10 to 11:40, Dr. Appleby and Dr. Smith from Cook Children's Behavioral Health Clinic and Rachel McComber from Louisville ISD will share helpful interventions at home and at school. And from 11:50 to 12:20, Dr. Pierce, who is a psychiatrist in Denton, will share ways to prevent caregiver burnout. We do not have scheduled breaks during our time together, but we will pause in between the presentations to take questions. Feel free to take a break during this time or when you may need. An evaluation link for today's event will be shared at the end of the program. All are encouraged to complete this evaluation. Please note that it is required for you to receive continuing education units. For your convenience, we have created an event packet for your use for your use as you follow along with today's presentations. You should receive an email link that has the event packet included. If you did not receive this, please let us know in the chat and include your email so we can resend that to you. Later today, those that attended will receive an email with a link to fill out the online evaluation about today's workshop. And there will also be time included at the end of today's workshop to do that as well. You can print out your certificate letter when it is convenient for you to do so. Today's speakers have no conflicts of interest to report regarding today's presentation. Okay, that was a lot. We got through it. On to the next piece. Before introducing our first speaker, I would like to share with you about why we do the things that we do. In 2011, the Watch Coalition was formed by a group of dedicated organizations and individuals who were committing to improving the total wellness of children and families in Denton County. Our vision is, because every child deserves hope, the Denton County community dedicates its unified resources to equip our children to reach their full potential mentally, physically, and socially to achieve their maximum personal success. One key strategy to achieve this goal is to maintain a diverse and active membership. We are a collaborative of both public and private organizations and individuals who are invested in the total wellness of Denton County's children. Our shared passion of improving children's mental health is the guidepost by which we base our choices. We understand the value of working together to improve children's mental health, and we are truly grateful for all of our members, volunteers, partners, and allies. We regularly work to strengthen the network of mental health professionals by offering educational and networking opportunities related to children's mental health, like this workshop today. We also invite the parents in our community who feel they might benefit from attending these workshops. If you are a parent attending today's workshop, thank you so much for coming. Please feel free to visit the C4CH website at www.cookchildrenscommunity.org, where you will find more information about Watch, resources, information about our community events, materials from past workshops, and so much more. I would like to thank the members of the Education Work Group for their work in planning this workshop. I can see by all of you who came today that this is a much needed topic, and we're excited to be able to share it with you. I am now pleased to introduce our first speaker, Kelly Garcia. Kelly Garcia is a bilingual English and Spanish licensed professional counselor supervisor and registered play therapist. She earned her master's degree in counseling from Argosy University and is the owner of Soleil Counseling Services in Denton. She has been a clinical therapist since 2013 and enjoys working with the kiddos and their families on their journey toward growth and healing. She is the president-elect of the North Texas chapter of the Texas Association for Play Therapy and a member of the Wellness Alliance for Total Children's Health in Denton County. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kelly.
So I'm going to start us off this morning by talking about the current trends in anxiety. We're going to get the fun statistics stuff over for you early this morning so that you can get into the good interventions this afternoon or later this morning with our other speakers. So get ready for a wild ride and some statistics. But before we do that, we're going to get mindful first. We're going to kind of take a second to get ready to learn. We're going to get present and clear our minds a little bit so that we can soak up all this good information and bring it back to the people we work with, the people in our lives that we care about. So I'm going to invite you to take a moment, put your feet flat on the floor if you can. If you're not able to, that's okay. And I just want you to just notice where your feet touch the floor. And I want you to take a couple of deep breaths. You're going to breathe in your nose and out your mouth. And we're looking to expand our stomachs rather than our chest. So imagine a balloon in your stomach that's getting full of air as you take a deep breath in. And then breathe out. We're going to do that just a few times. So you're going to breathe in your nose and breathe out. Good. Let's do that one more time. Breathe in and then breathe out. And just continue to notice your breath. I want you to notice where your body sits in your seat, where it makes contact with the seat that you're in. Notice the temperature in the room around you, if it's cool or if it's warm. And you can even use your hands and kind of put them on the seat next to you. Notice the texture of the seat that you're in. Mine is a leather chair, so it feels very smooth, but just notice the texture there. Notice any sounds in the room around you. And then I'm going to ask you to do something a little strange. I want you to just take a moment. You can close your eyes or keep them open, whatever feels comfortable. And I just want you, I'm going to close my eyes just because it helps me to imagine what I'm telling you to do here. But I just want you to close your eyes for a moment, noticing your breath going in your nose and out your mouth. And I want you to imagine that you have tree branches coming out from the bottom of your feet that are touching the floor and slowly growing into the earth. And I want you to notice as they break through the earth and really ground you into the earth. Let the tree branches anchor you to this present moment. And any stress or tension that you feel in your body this morning, whether that was getting stuck in traffic or kids just not listening this morning, just take a moment and let that tension travel through your body, down into your legs, and down the tree branches into the earth, and let the earth just soak that up for you. Any tension or stress you have in your mind, let that go. And we're going to set the intention that we're going to open our minds to learn valuable information today and ask questions that need to be asked. And then taking this information back into our lives to use with what we need to. Just take one more final deep breath. And then we're going to go ahead and get started with that good information. And I just want to take a moment. I know they mentioned that we didn't have any formal break. So if you need to have a break, please feel free to get up from your seat, get some water, walk around, step outside for a moment if you need to, because this is a lot of information. And some of this information may be heavy for you. It may remind you of somebody that you know, or even remind you of something within yourself, and that's okay. If that happens, take a moment to breathe, reconnect with the earth, get your feet back on the ground, and notice where you're at so that you can be present, but more importantly, so that you can take care of yourself. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and move on. All right. So the reason that we're all here today is to talk about anxiety, but we're going to kind of span out a little bit and take a little bit more of a global look, a little more spanned in the United States, look at just mental health in general before we really kind of scope into talking about anxiety. So, children's mental health here in the United States, it's crazy, y'all, but let's talk about it. So the most commonly diagnosed things in the United States are ADHD, anxiety problems, behavioral issues, and depression among children. And the estimates for ever having a diagnosis among children 3 to 17 years old a few years ago was 9.8% for ADHD, 9% for anxiety, and about 9% for behavioral problems. So ever having a diagnosis among children was about 9% with those top three things there: ADHD, anxiety, and behavioral issues, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, are all very interwebbed. There's a lot of co-occurring disorders that happen with anxiety, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But just ever having a diagnosis, almost 10%, that's a lot of kiddos. And this was in 2016 to 2019. So we can imagine that has grown since then. Co-occurring disorders among children of the same age, about 3 in 4 kiddos with depression also had anxiety. Like we talked about a moment ago, that we have more than one thing happening at once for kiddos, and that's very common. And almost 1 in 2 had behavioral problems. For kiddos that had anxiety, more than 1 in 3 also had behavioral problems. So a lot of parents are seeing that kiddos that have anxiety, that's coming out in a very external way through their behaviors. For kiddos with behavioral problems, more than 1 in 3 also had anxiety, which I'm just noticing that's kind of redundant. So pardon me there. And that both depression and anxiety have increased over time. And we're going to see, these are kind of some later studies, but we're going to talk a little bit here in a moment about the pandemic and how that's affected things. And that has really raised those rates quite a bit. So that's kind of looking at the United States as a whole, where we're at before pandemic, 2016 to 19, looking about 10% of kiddos ever having a diagnosis of some of the most commonly diagnosed things. And I love graphs. I'm a visual person, so I like to see it in visual ways. And so you can see here, looking at the pie graph, that's a pretty big slice of that pie of kiddos who have ever been diagnosed with some sort of common mental health disorder. That's a pretty big slice of the pie there. And then another pretty staggering statistic was between 2009 and 2019, suicidal behaviors among high school students increased 40%. And again, this is pre-pandemic, so we're going to talk about that in a moment, but just that's a very large percentage, 40% of high school students, growing from 2009 to 2019, 40% of some sort of suicidal behavior. And that can include a lot of different things. That can include having ideation, that can include actually attempting some sort of suicidal behavior. But that's a very staggering statistic to look at, that 40%. And then something to note here too is that 20% of children diagnosed with mental health challenges were the leading cause of death and disability in this age group. And that's kind of partly what this pie graph is referring to, is that those 20% that are graphed there, that was the leading cause of death for kiddos in that age group. And that's a pretty sad statistic. And that's why we're here today, is to talk about how to help these kiddos. So if we kind of span in a little bit, kind of scan into our neck of the woods here in Texas, we get to find out some even more fun information about how Texas ranks 50 out of 51 states, and that includes Washington, D.C. We are the biggest state, and we are almost last in how many providers we have per citizen. So we have 1 provider of mental health services to every 830 citizens in our state. If we even scan in closer and we zoom in Denton County, we have 1 provider for every 890 citizens. So we're the second to last in the United States for how many providers we have for citizens. And then in our state, we are the last county, last in Texas, for access to mental health services because of our own statistics. So we're the last almost in the nation, if you kind of think of it that way. And that is why we are here. That is why we are learning about these things, and why we come together in these groups to talk about how we can help the kiddos in our community. In Denton County in 2021, there were 98 suicidal deaths. Now, that's not just for kiddos, that's from kiddos all the way up through the lifespan. But 98 deaths from suicide in 1 year in 2021. That's a lot of folks that that needlessly needed to take their lives, but that does include kiddos and teens. And then the psychiatrists at our county are very few. If you are a mental health provider, you probably know this. The ones that we do have are wonderful, but because they're wonderful and because they're so far and few between, they have wait lists. They have kiddos that are trying to get in, and it can be really difficult. And so sometimes we have to refer outside of our county to get quicker services, or they're left having to wait for just a little bit before they can get in the door to get psychiatric services. And then on top of that, the psychiatric hospitals that we have in our county, they hold a certain amount of beds that people can sleep in overnight for inpatient services. We have 0 pediatric beds, 0. We have 24 adolescent beds, which is wonderful, but they're full. They're almost consistently full. And so if you've ever had an experience with UBH, which is one of our adolescent psychiatric units here in Denton County, they're almost consistently full. And that's very disheartening to know that we don't have enough beds for kiddos who need it. And even more disheartening that we don't have any beds for kiddos if they really need those services, if they're a danger to themselves or someone else, and we have to refer them to a psychiatric hospital. So a lot of times those kiddos are getting sent out to other counties and further away from parents. And that's a big challenge for families in our community. So just to kind of a little bit more here, for Denton ISD, in 2021 school year to 2022 school year, so that fall to spring, school year, they sent approximately 646 students to counseling services within our school district in Denton County. And they did that for suicidal ideation. That was what that assessment was for, but that's a lot of kiddos having to be sent for referrals. And luckily, our school district here in Denton County has wonderful counselors on staff, and I myself have worked very closely with a lot of those counselors, and they're wonderful. But man, are they busy. And if you think about that, these folks are getting these kiddos for suicidal ideation and their own, mental health things going on, and they don't have anywhere to refer them to, or if they do, it's a little further out. And so, that's, again, that's why we're here, and that's why we do what we do. Of all the school-age children in Denton County that needed mental health care, over half experienced difficulty accessing care. And Cook Children's did a analysis of that in 2021. So I'm a visual person, and when I look at this picture and I think of how half of these kiddos had difficulty getting care in our area, that really hurts my heart, because even just one kiddo having difficulty accessing care is challenging. But then when you see more than one, it really puts that into perspective, how we need to amp up our mental health services. Now, that's not to say that once they receive those services that they're not getting good quality care. But again, we just don't have enough of those services. And so if you're in the mental health field and you're working in our county, I know that you are swamped, and thank you for everything you do. If you're a parent of a kiddo that is experiencing some mental health things, just know that even if you are having trouble finding a provider, we will help you find one. Reach out to somebody. We will help you find somebody, even if we are not able to see your kiddo right away. A couple of additional considerations to note, among children aged 2 to 8, and I don't know if this will be super surprising or not, but boys were more likely than girls to have a mental behavioral issues, developmental disorder, something of that nature, that puts them on that spectrum of mental health issues. And so boys were more likely than girls to have that. Again, I think that's probably not quite surprising, but one statistic that I did not add on here, and I don't know the percentage, to be honest with you, but as we talk more about anxiety further along in this presentation and the ones in the future here, girls are statistically more diagnosed with anxiety disorders than boys. For behavioral issues, boys are typically more diagnosed with that than girls. Among children living below the federal poverty level, more than 1 in 5%, I'm sorry, 1 in 5 kiddos had a mental health, behavioral health, or developmental disorder. So 1 in 5 kiddos below the federal poverty level had some sort of disorder. And we're going to talk a little bit more about why that is and what raises that statistic there. Age and poverty level definitely affect the likelihood of children getting treatment. The younger the kiddo, the more difficult to find services. And poverty level makes it difficult to find services that are affordable and within a family's budget. ACEs, which you may or may not have heard of, they're adverse childhood events or experiences. Adverse childhood experiences, this is based on a study done by Kaiser. I'm not exactly sure the years, but I know it was a 20-year-long study where they essentially surveyed patients who had experienced a different variety of possible traumas or challenges that can occur in a child's life. So things like obvious like abuse and neglect, but then also things like divorce, things like alcoholism in the family. And the higher number of those experiences that a child has, they found out that within this 20-year study, that later on in life, there were more physical and mental health challenges, and also the possibility of an earlier death than those who did not have a higher number of adverse childhood experiences. And so this is important to note because a lot of times, not a lot of times, but sometimes when kiddos have anxiety, this is created from some of those adverse childhood experiences, and those are pretty correlated. So among children aged 6 to 17 years, children who were discriminated against based on race or ethnicity had higher percentages of physical health conditions or mental health conditions. And so having some sort of discrimination or racism, things of those that nature that a kiddo may have experienced increases the likelihood of having some sort of physical or mental health condition. It may increase the number of ACEs that they have, the number of adverse childhood experiences that they had. Discrimination was almost 7 times as common among kiddos with 3 or more ACEs compared to those with no ACEs. And so that's really important to note because having those cultural differences can also play a role in what that looks like for our mental health and physical health in childhood and later on in life. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about the effects of the pandemic and even just the global issues that are occurring in the world right now on anxiety, because this definitely I even know for myself personally, and maybe for yourself, the pandemic definitely changed things for a lot of us. It really, for me, it had a life-changing effect. I changed my position that I was in at the time because of it, and it just, whoo, it was something. But when we look at kiddos who have been affected by the pandemic, looking statistically, so the the Journal for American Medical Association, I think that's what it is, for pediatrics. I think that's what JAMA stands for, if I'm not mistaken. If I'm wrong, pardon me, correct me. But they did a meta-analysis. They did a really big study with 29 samples and 80,879 youth. It was a really big study. And what they did was they compared the amount of anxiety that kiddos had before the pandemic to after. And based on that study, they found that 11.6 of kids had anxiety in 2012. And even just before pandemic, that was up 20% from 2007. So that's before pandemic. After the pandemic, these numbers nearly doubled. So about 2021, 20% of youth worldwide struggle with anxiety symptoms. So that's not just within our nation, but just globally. This was a global analysis. That's a huge jump. Some of those reasons for the pandemic doing that was that we were in isolation more. Kiddos weren't able to go to school in person. They were doing school over virtual means, which can be very disconnecting, although very helpful, but can be disconnecting, especially when a kiddo is learning how to connect with others, socialize, and develop in different ways that are needed with connection. This also made them miss milestones. So things like socializing with peers and understanding problem solving because they're amongst peers and doing the things that kiddos naturally do, like play. That definitely made some milestones be missed. And this also increased family tension. So with everybody back kind of being stuck in the house, with more time spent that way, there is definitely more tension. I know that happened in my own family, and we didn't even have kiddos that lived with us. So I can only imagine with kiddos being bored and feeling stuck and cooped up, what that might have felt like. And then also not being able to play with other kiddos outside of their family as much. The other thing that happened there that I didn't notate on here, but I think and at least in my own practice, seeing kiddos right after the pandemic or even during the pandemic virtually or in person with masks, there was definitely a higher increase of kiddos who had anxiety around germs, who had anxiety around being sick and what that means. And to this day, I still have kiddos who struggle with that. The rise in things like obsession with washing hands. Something touched my mouth and that really grossed me out. And now am I going to die? That just happened yesterday. So we have kiddos who still struggle with the effects of the pandemic to this day, and have that increase in anxiety for sure. Some other things to know, national and global issues like recent school shootings, political unrest, the wars that are happening in Ukraine and the Middle East. Kiddos have more access to news, to what's going on in the world. And then they talk about it. So when they find out these things, they're talking about it. Sometimes they're even playing it out. And it does raise anxiety. There's worry that there's going to be a school shooting in my school. There's worry that, that the war is going to come here and it's going to affect me. And am I going to die? There's worry about the political unrest and how does that impact my family? Especially if a family is marginalized or oppressed in some way. There's even more of that unrest of, how is this change in our politics going to affect me personally and my family? So these things are getting talked about with the kiddos that we're seeing, and they even come into the therapy room. I have kids that specifically see me for these issues. So definitely a rise in the anxiety surrounding issues that are on a global level. Like I mentioned before, social media use and just the access to internet it just exponentially increases the rates in impulsivity, becoming bored easily, and comparing yourself to others. And if you've heard of FOMO or that fear of missing out, that's definitely something that it's real. This is something that even adults experience. I myself experienced this where I catch myself scrolling on my phone and not even realizing it. So we just get bored more easily because we're getting stimulated so much by these technologies. And even if you're like, I'm just scrolling through Instagram, it's just pictures. That's what I hear a lot. That's just pictures. That's not bad. Well, when you're seeing pictures, you're still, your brain still kind of goes to that comparison mode. So we're seeing a lot of teenagers, especially who, they have that comparison to others, and that definitely increases anxiety. Based on that meta-analysis study, 1 in 4 youth have depressive symptoms and 1 in 5 youth have anxiety symptoms. And again, that was based on that study by the JAMA Pediatrics Journal. Okay, we're not gonna go too much in defining anxiety. Oh, my little video is not playing. Darn. Okay. I had a little video there of, I don't know if you've seen this meme. It's really cute. The baby's like smiling and then the mom scares the baby and it goes, ah. Um, I thought that was cute. But I just wanted to touch base before we go more into anxiety within the developmental stages, on what anxiety is. We're going to learn more about that in some of the other presentations and defining anxiety a little bit more in detail. But anxiety is essentially a sense of worry that comes as tension, apprehension, distress, and you may have a threat of danger and you may not. Um, Fear is more a reaction to an actual stimulus, to something that is causing potential danger. So that means that there's a threat that's near and it may be imminent, it may be happening right now. Both of these things are needed. We need to have anxiety and fear. These things help us to be alert. They help us to quickly prepare in a situation and respond with immediate action. So if you're taking a test at school, you want to have anxiety. You want to have a little bit of stress response. That stress response creates cortisol in our body. That's a hormone that essentially increases the stress response, and it creates hyper focus. It creates more laser focused awareness in a situation, and we're able to think more quickly. And that's needed. If we're taking a test, heck yeah, I want that. If I'm fixing to get in a car accident or somebody runs across the street in front of me, I want that quick response. So it does help. It's when it becomes too much that we're looking at some atypical things. So again, we're not going to get too much into the definition of anxiety, but I did want to at least show, and I'm sure most people are aware of this, but if you're not, a typical fear response in the brain comes out in one of these ways. You either fight, meaning that you have some sort of physical movement, you're trying to get out of the situation. You might flight, so meaning that you might try to get away, you might run away, you might get away from the situation physically if it's not a physical danger. You might freeze. This one is actually more popular than people think, but freezing means that you might get quiet, you might shut down, you might just stay still. That's kind of the freeze response. And now we also know that we can also fawn and faint. These are two newer ones if you're not familiar with these. Fawning is essentially people pleasing and going to that place of saying yes when you really mean no. So for example, if somebody says, maybe you feel a sense of threat from your boss and your boss is like, hey, I need you to get this project done. And you know that essentially that you don't have to get it done right away, but your boss is maybe just pushing a little bit hard, you might have a fear response that kicks in if that's something that really intimidates you or triggers you in some way. Some people will fight. They might argue back. Some people might run away and be like, okay. Others might freeze. I'm a freezer. Or they might people please and be like, yes, ma'am, I'm going to get right on that and get to work on it. And then inside feel not so great. I don't know if that was the best example, but that may be one example of what that can look like. And then we also know that fainting is another fear response, and this can maybe happen more in some higher tense, higher anxiety-provoking situations, perhaps abuse, maybe even being in a situation where there's physical danger. Fainting is another fear response that happens. Our body literally shuts down to the point that we become unconscious. So I just wanted to touch briefly on that these are the common fear responses, and they're also related to anxiety in the sense that because anxiety and fear are so related, they're like cousins. Sometimes with anxiety, it can cross over into these fear responses, especially if there's trauma present. And then we're looking at having one of these responses to a situation that's anxiety provoking. Okay. So we're going to take a look at anxiety in some different developmental stages. And I think what I'm going to do, because I've been talking for a minute and I think my time is, I think my time is almost up. Is that correct? Man, that went
You have
fast.
until 10 o'clock, Kelly.
I do.
Yeah.
Hooray.
We've
Well,
got
you'll get to
about
listen to me
15 minutes.
longer. I thought it was 9:45. Thank you for telling me. I appreciate that. Okay, since I've been droning on for a minute about statistics, let's do something fun. I'm going to skip ahead here. How do I skip ahead? Skip ahead. Okay. Hopefully I can get this to play, but we're going to watch a very short video. And essentially what I want you to do as we're watching this video is I want you to notice how your body responds to this video. Do you feel a sense of joy? Do you feel a sense of pleasantry or contentment? Or do you feel a sense of tension? Do you feel your body tightening up? Do you feel a rise of warmth in your body? Notice what your body is doing. And as you're doing that, I'm going to ask you at the end of the video to kind of ask yourself on a scale of 0 to 10, with 10 being the most anxious you've ever felt and 0 being none at all, where you lie on that scale. And we're going to talk about what that means. And yeah, just see what you notice. So what did you notice as you watched that video? How did your body feel? And if you want to answer in the chat box, you're welcome to. Yeah, Letitia said stressed. Tracy said slightly irritated, disappointed, increased heart rate. Reminds you of tense times, disappointed. Yeah. Lots of ahs. Yep, that was me. Especially the DVD part. I'm like, oh, it didn't go in the corner. Oh, I like that. Somebody said that's just life sometimes. And that is such a great positive outlook. Yes. Uh-huh. What happened? Some anxiety. Yes. So I think we experienced a lot of the same things. A little bit of anxiety, a slight tension. I know for me, when I very first watched this, right now I got a little bit more stressed about not being able to play the video for you, but I felt that stress too. And that definitely increased my heart rate. I could feel in my shoulders just that creeping up of the tension. The first time I watched it, I even felt like a flush of frustration and anger. So yeah, lump in the throat. Oh, I love that, David. Thank you for sharing that. We also get those physical sensations are so important, and we all experience them. We experience those different. And I appreciate noticing that in your body because we feel the emotions, right? We feel the anxiety, we feel the stress. But the Thank you, Teresa. I do a lot of positive self-talk to myself. If I don't, then I get outside of my window of being able to tolerate that stress. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. I have ADHD. And so sometimes it's very easy for me to get frustrated, and I have to essentially parent myself and talk to myself a little bit so that I can get through situations. So thank you for noticing that, Teresa. I appreciate that. So I want you to notice what number on that scale did that raise you up to? For me, just being stressed about the video itself and maybe not getting it to play the way I wanted it to, I probably got to a 4, a good solid 4. I can feel it in my chest a little bit. I still feel it in my back, that creepy crawly feeling. But I want you to just imagine for a moment that right now we watched a 1-minute video and I feel it a 4, and you may feel it a different number, and that's okay. Whatever number came up for you. But I want you to imagine for a moment that on top of that stress, you also have thoughts that just continuously play on a tape loop in your mind, that kind of are like an itch in the brain, and you can't just get those thoughts to stop. But you're constantly worried about what's going to happen next. Well, what if this happens? And how that number for you might go up. So for somebody who does struggle with anxiety sometimes, that number may go up to a 5 or a 6, because I'm in the background having my tab open, if you will, of the what ifs and what's going to happen, and well, how am I going to do this and what's happening next? So constant anxiety, right? Or let's say you're neurodivergent. Let's say that you also have autism, and you sometimes don't feel understood by others as fully as you wanted to feel understood by others. And so you constantly have that tab open in the background of nobody really gets me. And imagine how that might feel for that number, that 4, from the tension and stress we just felt, if that might go up a little bit for somebody who's in that space. And so what I'm talking about here is how we all have different things that impact us day to day. And we're going to talk about this more here. What happened? There we go. We have an ability to tolerate things in a certain way. Every day is different, and every person is different. And you may have heard of the window of tolerance, and you may have not, but I think it's a very important thing to touch on when it comes to feeling distressed, feeling anxious, because that window changes for everybody every day based on so many things. So right now, probably for the majority of us, we probably were able to get that stress feeling from that video and stay within our ability to tolerate that, our window that's like this. So we're here in that window, and we go, let me do it this way. We go up and we're a little bit stressed, but it comes back down naturally. And we didn't go above that line. So we were able to handle it and manage that stress pretty easily. Now, let's say that you have a kiddo who they get stressed and it goes up and down, but now they're hungry. They're really hungry. They didn't have lunch at school. So that window to tolerate things goes down. And let's say they're really tired. They didn't sleep very well. Maybe they're having nightmares from the anxiety that they're having about, those kind of things. Then maybe that window shrinks even more. That window of being able to tolerate different things day to day shrinks, and sometimes it can grow. And that's what we're really looking for, is we're wanting to stretch that ability to tolerate things little by little, so that when we do get stressed, when we do get anxious, it doesn't come outside of that window, and we can manage it better. So what happens when it goes outside of that window? Some things. If it goes too high, we go into hyperarousal. So this is when you might see a kiddo get angry, get physical. The anxiety is a hyperarousal state. So anxiety may not be external. We may not see anything on the outside, but inside it feels like a chaotic whirlwind or a tornado or thunder. So just a rumbly sensation of the what ifs and the worries and the how do I do this, and so you can imagine it, that sort of feeling, that feeling on the inside. So a lot of times anxiety doesn't even present as an external thing, it's internal. Hypoarousal is the down state of being able to tolerate. So that's when you're freezing, where our kids are shutting down, they can become silent, they look paralyzed, they get disconnected. And so this is just something really important to notice for our kiddos especially, but even for ourselves, because us as people who are important to the lives of kiddos in our community, we have to be able to watch our ability to stay within that window of tolerating as well. I could go on a whole tangent about co-regulating and regulating with your kiddos. We don't have time for that, but it's definitely something to look into on how to co-regulate with your kiddos and stay regulated yourself. So I'm watching my time here, and we have just a little bit of time left. And I just very quickly want to go through what typical versus atypical anxiety looks like in kiddos. So like I said earlier, anxiety is normal. We want to have anxiety. And for kiddos, you're going to see that in different ways. For your newborns, infants, toddlers, the smaller kiddos, you're looking at more concrete fear. So it's black and white, loud noises, not seeing a caregiver's face within their vision, line of vision, maybe fear of the dark, possible separation anxiety, things like that, that are very black and white and more fear-based rather than the anxiety that we might think of as worry and things like that. As kiddos get older, that's when the anxiety part does kick in a little bit more because they're going to school. They're around peers and they start comparing. They're starting to learn that how to empathize with others, how to share, how to play nicely, how to make good decisions, the moral values that are kicking in. And so the anxieties kick in of, am I doing good in school? What if my mom forgets to pick me up? What if I get bad grades in school? What if I misbehave? And then as you're looking at later in adolescence, you're looking at a more mature brain. And so the anxieties start to look more like being disliked or liked and around self-identity. So things like, what if no one likes me? What if they don't want to hang out with me? And what does this mean about me that so-and-so said this? So again, this is just a list. This will be part of your presentation that you received. But this is just a list of some common anxieties that you might see in kiddos in different developmental stages and what those look like. And again, these are the common ones. We want to have some anxiety. But when it moves from typical to atypical, what you're looking at is not being able to function well. Do those anxieties overwhelm the system? Are we getting outside of our ability to tolerate these anxieties? And if so, are we able to reach out for support? Do we have a good foundation of support within our family, from school, and our community? And can we cope with those stressors in a healthy way? So there's a lot of factors that play into creating a scenario where atypical anxiety might occur. Some vulnerabilities in biologics and genetics. So if a parent has anxiety, if a parent has ADHD, if a parent has autism, it is more likely that a kiddo would have something of that of their own, meaning that the brain is having some clinical anxiety with perhaps a lower level of serotonin, something of that nature. Environmental risk factors. If a mom or dad has postpartum depression or anxiety, I notice that a lot with the kiddos I see, that if a mom had postpartum depression or anxiety, that a kiddo may have more anxiety later on in life. If there was drug use or alcohol use during pregnancy, or if mom had domestic violence during pregnancy or other stressors in their life and they were stressed, sometimes those risk factors do play a part in seeing anxiety in a child's life. Other negative life events or experiences like trauma from sexual abuse, neglect, physical abuse, of course, bring on anxieties of their own. And then other family-based vulnerabilities, such as being below poverty level or having a low socioeconomic status. And so worry about financing needs and just worrying about the basic necessities of food, shelter, clothes, and water, or being born into a Black, Indigenous, person of color family, so a BIPOC family, or a family that has members of the LGBTQ community in that family. And so there's other worries from the environment that they're in and how that might play a factor in how their family is affected. Others, lack of self-protective factors. So again, coming back to if that kiddo doesn't have very good coping skills, if they never learned what to do with their feelings, if they go to the negative cognitions, those negative thoughts of, I am bad, I did something wrong. And if they don't have the ability to regulate their emotions in a healthy way. And that comes back to, do I go up inside of my window of tolerance and can I stay in my window of tolerance, or do I go outside of that window and become dysregulated? And again, I could talk more about that, but we're not going to go into that right now. And so if that, if that happens, can they come back into their window somehow? Do they know how to take deep breaths? Do they know how to self-soothe? Those kind of things. And then avoidance and cognitive distortions. We kind of talked about the distortions, but avoidance of, I don't like to think about my anxiety, so let me just shove them down. And we know that the more that we don't talk about things, the more that we don't feel through those things, that they kind of get stuck. And when they're in the dark, it grows. I know some other presentations are going to talk a little bit more about the diagnosis surrounding anxiety. And so we're not going to go too much into that, but generalized anxiety disorder is the most commonly diagnosed anxiety disorder for kiddos. And there are different criteria that need to be met in order to actually be diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. But this is one of the most commonly diagnosed anxiety disorders among children. Some other commonly diagnosed anxiety disorders are separation anxiety, OCD, panic disorder, some specific phobias, particularly germophobia has been very common after the pandemic, social phobia, and selective mutism. Some other diagnoses that are linked, and so are kind of like cousins to anxiety, meaning that they may be a secondary disorder to these primary diagnoses, or these could be a secondary, but more than likely anxiety would be a secondary diagnosis. So things like post-traumatic stress disorder, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, depression, adjustment disorder, personality disorders, body dysmorphia, eating disorders, and learning disorders. Learning disorders bring about a lot of anxiety for kiddos, especially when they notice that they have something that other kiddos don't have to struggle with. So that's definitely a high correlation there. Neurodivergence and anxiety. If a person is neurodivergent, meaning that they have some other mental health things going on for them that essentially their brain is developed in a unique way. Neurodivergence was coined by Judy Singer in 1998 to essentially take away the stigma from normal versus abnormal mental health and kind of have an umbrella term that says everybody's different. We all have different brain development. We all think differently. And so when somebody is neurodivergent, essentially that means that they might feel like they are different from the norm. But this is I think this is a better term to find a fit where we're at with mental health, especially now that we know more about mental health and that we're seeing that it's not taboo. It's just the same as physical health. We have to take care of our mental health. And so it's not that you don't or do have mental health. You have mental health. It's just, what do we do with that? And what comes up that for you. So if you do have anxiety, if you do have depression, or if you don't struggle with those things, that means you might have great mental health. I hope that you do. For a large amount of people, including myself, that's something that we struggle with, but we also learn to cope with, and we also learn a lot from. And so there is a lot of healing and hope that comes with that. And so my last little note here is that if anxiety is interrupting a child's functioning in your life, whether that's externally with their behaviors, whether that's looking anxious, getting tense, or if it's internal, maybe they're quiet and you can see that their clock is ticking, but nothing's coming out. And so you kind of know that there's something going on internally, but they're not able to function well. That's when it's time to seek professional help. That's the biggest thing that I tell parents, is that kids have anxiety. That's normal. But when we're not able to function well, let's reach out for help, and there's help available, even if it is outside of our county and we have to refer you out. But we have a ton of sources here. I am available for questions if you have any questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Kelly, for your presentation. We are so appreciative. And yes, we are going to have time for just a few questions before moving on to our next speakers. So if you do have a question for Kelly, please type that in the Q&A, and we will have just a few minutes for those. So I'll be monitoring right here in the Q&A, and I'll let you know if anything pops up, Kelly.
Absolutely. Thank you. Somebody asked for contact information, and I will type that in the chat box for you guys.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for your
Kelly,
time.
we did have a request for the YouTube video that you
Oh,
shared.
I see that. Yes.
If you can put that in the chat as well, the link to that, that would be very
I
helpful.
would be happy to do that.
Wonderful. Okay. While Kelly is putting that link in the chat, I will go ahead and introduce our next speakers. Okay. Dr. Whitney Appleby is a licensed psychologist with Cook Children's Medical Center, where she provides therapy services as well as psychological evaluations for children and adolescents. She received her doctorate in school psychology from Texas Women's University, completed an APA accredited internship with Cypress Fairbanks ISD, and a 2-year neuropsychology postdoctoral fellowship with Cook Children's prior to being hired on as a full-time staff member with Cook Children's. Dr. Appleby enjoys spending time with her spouse and 3 children, doing puzzles, gardening, and raising chickens. Dr. Amanda Smith is a native of North Carolina, where she received an undergraduate degree in sports medicine from Ellen College and a master's degree in counselor education from East Carolina University. She worked as a school counselor for 6 years before moving to Texas to pursue a PhD in school psychology at Texas Women's University. Amanda completed her internship in Lake Dallas ISD, followed by a postdoctoral fellowship in neuropsychology at Cook Children's. She liked it there so much that she decided to stay and currently works as a licensed psychologist in the Denton Behavioral Health Outpatient Clinic, where she sees children and adolescents for psychological and neuropsychological evaluations and therapy. In her spare time, she enjoys traveling, camping, and spending time with her animals, a Great Pyrenees named Barley and 2 Siamese mixes named Azor and Toby. Dr. Appleby and Dr. Smith will discuss home-based interventions. Rachel McComber is a student assistance counselor at the Colony High School in the Colony, Texas, within Louisville ISD. Before the Colony High School, Rachel was a clinical social worker with Lake Travis ISD in the hills of Austin. Rachel has 12 years of social work experience split equally between varying school districts and roles, and in the pediatric hospital setting as both a clinician and social worker. Rachel is an animal lover who enjoys the outdoors. She finds happiness in walks, hikes, cooking, concerts, and going to the movies with her husband. Rachel will be sharing school support interventions for teens. Thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Lindsay. I appreciate that. I'm Dr. Amanda Smith, and I have my colleague, Dr. Appleby, over here. She'll be joining us in a bit. So let me get our presentation shared. I remember how to do that. It's been a while. Oops. There we go. Share screen. There. All right. I think we're set. We're ready to go now. All right. So today we're going to be talking about
Dr. Smith, I'm sorry, we're seeing your presentation view. Can you switch it to the slideshow view? See up at the top where it says display settings, click on that and go to the to your left where it says display settings.
Okay.
Click on that and swap.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so today we're going to talk about anxiety and school refusal from a clinical perspective, since Dr. Appleby and I both work for Cook Children. So we see kiddos outside of school, and we can just give you guys hopefully some tips and ideas on supporting our kids with anxiety outside of school. So what is anxiety? Kelly did an amazing job covering a lot of this, so I'm probably going to rush through a few of these things because she's already talked about them. So, just some different definitions of words we sort of use interchangeably with anxiety, fear, anxiety, worry, stress. They all have slightly different meanings, but oftentimes we sort of use them interchangeably. I think an important distinction, which Kelly also mentioned, is there's a difference between, a typical amount of anxiety or experiencing anxiety in response to specific events versus having an anxiety disorder. So it has to be out of proportion, beyond what's expected developmentally, and cause significant distress or impact of your functioning to kind of tip over to that anxiety disorder realm. So I have a graphic there with some of the typical anxiety disorders in childhood that Kelly also covered. The most common comorbidity with anxiety is more anxiety. So it can kind of be cumulative. Someone may have, a specific phobia, but also separation anxiety. So they can be diagnosed separately sometimes as well. Other disorders like depression commonly co-occur as kids become adolescents. That's a lot more common. And then there's other externalizing disorders like ADHD that can co-occur with anxiety, as well as autism, which probably did a spectacular job covering some neurodiversity. Right. So I wanted to talk for just a minute about what anxiety looks like in kids and teens, because we may often see some, of those other types of fight or flight, freeze, fawn, faint responses that aren't necessarily a direct line to, oh, this is anxiety. That may not be our first thought. So, kids with anxiety may be more clingy, more fidgety, a lot of somatic complaints, headaches, stomach aches, aches and pains, stuff like that. Changes in eating and sleeping, getting angry or upset more quickly, having just crying spells that they can't really explain why, and they seem to kind of come out of nowhere, difficulty concentrating. And then which is called, Brene Brown came up with the term chandeliering, which basically is kind of flying up to the chandeliers all of a sudden. And this typically happens in kids that aren't really good about sharing their feelings and trying to either mask or hold in, their feelings about their anxious experiences. So then one sort of seemingly innocent comment or one thing that doesn't seem like it should evoke that severe of a response kind of sends them through the roof. So that's another common thing we see with anxiety. This is just another way to sort of conceptualize it, that, at the bottom we have sort of these deep experiences or feelings that contribute to anxiety, which still may kind of rest under the surface. And then what's above the water is what we see out on the outside that may all be linked back to it. And one of the things that I think very well-meaning parents and families can inadvertently contribute to anxiety. Again, Kelly did a great job of talking about some contributing factors and risk factors for anxiety in various populations, specifically to parents, families having models of anxiety. So if a child sees a parent or family member responding in a very dysregulated, anxious way, they can kind of learn that just through modeling inadvertently. It's the same thing with unrealistic fear installation when adults around them have, very large responses to things like, there's a dog, oh my gosh, it's a dog, and it's on the other side of a fence and it's 50 yards away, and the adult with them is freaking out about it. The kid can kind of learn that same behavior. Oh, every time I see a dog, that's a response that is a typical response that people have. And then parenting styles can also contribute to this. So we have sort of the two ends of the spectrum of the more over-controlling parents that don't give kids an opportunity to ever, make their own choices, develop a sense of mastery in things. They're kind of the helicopter parents that are over them all the time, and they can be overly critical or have really, consistently high expectations that aren't really achievable for the child. Maybe it's beyond their ability. Maybe it's beyond anybody's ability. And then the other end of the spectrum where we have caregivers that don't have healthy boundaries, that kind of let the kids make all the choices, so they never have this framework to operate within, and that can be very dysregulating for the kids not to have some structure and some consistency, as well as kind of that insecure parenting where we're bouncing back and forth between those two different styles, can also kind of contribute to that too. All right, so differential diagnosis. And I pulled this quote that I found because I thought it was really good. That kind of what differential diagnosis is basically trying to distinguish what's actually going on here. Is it, this thing? Is it the other thing? Is it both? And then why is that important? Well, because if we don't have an accurate diagnosis, that can lead to like incorrect treatment. Like maybe we're treating the kid for an anger issue when really it's anxiety. And if we could address the anxiety that's underneath the anger, then the anger would kind of resolve itself because they would learn better, coping tools and ways to manage their feelings. So I just pulled a couple examples of this. I love Misdiagnosis Monday. I think it's great. You can just do a Google search for these, but they have tons and tons of different diagnoses that have overlapping symptoms, and it kind of says how they're the same and how they're different. So I pulled one on ADHD and anxiety, and some of the things that they have in common: difficulty with concentration, difficulty with some memory, like working memory things, like, oh, what was I supposed to do on this assignment? Kind of getting confused and lost in the multi-step instructions. Restlessness, tension, irritability, just having those symptoms. It could be either one. We don't know without some further investigation. And then similar with social anxiety and autism, they share a lot of common characteristics. Don't like unexpected changes in social plans, feeling uncomfortable in social situations and with new people. And so having to look at some of these, how they're the same, but also how they're different can be really important. And then I did a separate one on trauma. And that was, gets kind of tricky because when we are discussing trauma, we have, like a single event trauma versus more of like complex trauma or developmental trauma. So it can kind of look different depending on the type of trauma that a person has experienced. Typically, especially in single event trauma, we can have, we can link the anxious feelings to the specific event. If a kid was in a car accident, now they don't want to ride in a car, we can kind of make that connection of, okay, this is probably a trauma response, as opposed to more generalized feelings of anxiety or dis-ease. Same thing with separation anxiety. If maybe something has happened to a family member, and now the kiddo doesn't want to be separated from the family member, they're constantly calling to check in. That kind of makes sense if they have a parent that's experiencing a major illness or has been in an accident or something like that. But when we look at developmental trauma, where kiddos have experienced multiple traumatic events from an early age, or even complex trauma where they've just unfortunately been exposed to a lot of different traumas, it can look more generalized because of different types of traumas. Now we're having different responses to those traumas. And so that way, that's why it's important sometimes to seek an evaluation and really kind of help sift through what is trauma, what is anxiety, and it can be both. So it's not an easy answer. All right, so a couple evidence-based interventions for anxiety in kids and adolescents. I think it's important. It's like, okay, we've identified it. Now what do we do? So, if you feel like as a parent that your kid is being negatively impacted, like that last slide that Kelly showed, their functioning is being compromised and it seems like maybe it's anxiety, talk to your kid's pediatrician or primary care provider. They can do some screenings and then help to determine, is this anxiety or not? Is this something else? What should we do? You can seek out a psychological evaluation, which is one of the things that we do here at Cooks. And then also if the anxiety symptoms are, impacting your kid's ability to go to school or to function at school. Kelly gave the great example of the test anxiety being like a little bit of anxiety is good. Like we need that to be on point. But if it's to the point where, they're, avoiding school, they're getting sick, they're like shaking and crying because they have to take a test, that's pretty impactful. So you would, definitely want to reach out to the school and see what they can do to help, either through, a 504 plan or an IEP, depending on what the child's needs are. All right. So all the research shows that having families involved, therapy does not occur in a vacuum. I say that all the time, that, we can work with the kid, but if the family is not also actively participating and working on the things that we work in session and helping kids translate that to home, we're not going to see a lot of change. So parent self-help can be a good first line of treatment for a little bit older kiddos like pre-adolescent. And I'm going to go over a few different options that can help parents at home with that. We've got some good resources we're going to share on that. Again, family-based therapy is really recommended in treating anxiety, and specifically cognitive behavioral therapy. which can be done with kids and adolescents, and even in really young kids, this can be done with the help of parents, using some like exposure types of things and some ways that parents can help kids as well. So even cognitive behavioral therapy can work for a big range of ages. Another option too are some medications. SSRIs are kind of the first line medication for treating kids and adolescents, and that can be combined with therapy for the most effectiveness. And I had Dr. Kristen Perch, one of our psychiatrists, was kind enough to share a couple slides with me because as psychologists in Texas, we do not prescribe medication. And Dr. Pierce is going to be on later, so she may also be able to offer some additional information about medication specifically, but I did want to kind of touch on it here. So as I talked about, there's different options, medication, therapy, or both. So typically what our psychiatrists here at Cook say, if it's mild to moderate anxiety, start with counseling. If it's moderate to severe, let's maybe do medication. And then, as well as the counseling. And then specifically school refusal, which Dr. Appleby is going to talk about, and I'm really excited about that, may require even a higher level of care, like a day treatment program, just to kind of help these kids reset and get back to a place where they can function a little bit better. So this is just another kind of conceptualization of cognitive behavioral therapy. So cognitive are thoughts, behavior are, how we act, and then our feelings. So all of those kind of have this interplay of affecting, our ability to function. So here's an example for kids that seemed appropriate for this. So, it's kids going to school. I may get called on in class and say the wrong thing today. So now they're getting anxious. They're having maybe fight or flight response, difficulty concentrating. So because they're so hyper aroused at school, they start avoiding school, or maybe if it's more of an OCD thing, they're checking, have I gotten my work done perfectly? Do I have all my materials? Bringing a protective item from home or something like, if I have my, stuffed teddy, I'll be okay. And just ways that they're trying to figure out to lower their anxiety and arousal and just get through the day sometimes. So our thoughts affect our feelings, affect how we act. All right, and then there's some subtypes of CBT out, and there's more than this. I just pulled a few that probably are the most familiar to people. So exposure therapy and exposure and response prevention, especially for phobias, for kids with OCD types of symptoms, social anxiety. Because basically what happens is, when people are anxious, they avoid the things that make them anxious. And sometimes that is needed and warranted. But when it starts limiting their world and it gets smaller and smaller to where I used to go to parties, I don't go to parties anymore. I used to, go to school, I don't go to school anymore. So now their world is shrinking and shrinking. So the idea of exposure is to gradually get them back to doing the things that they want to do, and not letting the fear and anxiety be in control of them. That they have the choice and they can make the choices to do the things they want to do. Sometimes even in spite of their anxiety. It doesn't necessarily mean it goes away, but it means that we can still learn to function, and again, kind of a values-based approach of I can do the things that I want to do that are important to me. Motivational interviewing, acceptance and commitment therapy, and DBT is also technically a subtype of DBT. So there's some other information about that. And then I did some research on a few different treatment programs. I thought this might be helpful, particularly for people who are not in the clinical realm. So Coping Cat is a curriculum that's been around for a while. I actually have it, this Coping Cat kind of, but it's a workbook that's therapist led, and it can help kids use these cognitive behavioral skills to work through some of their anxiety. And then the other two programs, the Cool Kids and the Brave program, are actually both out of Australia. The Brave program is online and it's free. And this is a resource for kids and parents that can kind of assist with anxiety for people that have kind of like a lower level of anxiety. There's different sessions that they work through and just learn some strategies. So if the kids basically just lacking strategies, parents don't really know what to do, I think that could be a great starting point. And then the Cool Kids Anxiety program is out of one of the universities in Australia, and it's more directive, so there is a cost associated with that, so it may be a little more cost prohibitive for families. But included with it are, like, every 2 weeks they do telephone kind of consultations with the family to see how they're going, how they're progressing through the modules. So there's more, hands-on with that. All right, so kind of back to our friend medication management. SSRIs, like I said, are the first line, and can even go down to kids as young as 6. I know some people or some providers are reluctant to go maybe below 8 years old, but there are medications, and that's the reason I left the slide in here, that there are medications that if kids need them, that they're available. I think there's a common misconception that, anxiety medications are not available to kids, and it's not so. All right, so now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Appleby and let her talk about some school avoidance and what we can do about that.
Hey, give us just a second. We're doing a little switcheroo over here. We just decided to hang out together this morning. So realizing how incredibly short I am. Sorry, guys. No, I'm good. I'll just sit on my feet. I do that anyway. So thank you all for having me join today. Thank you, Amanda, for convincing me to kind of jump on in and assist with talking about school refusal, school avoidance today. And my hope in talking about this, we sort of wanted to segue into a really narrow topic that is kind of expands upon just the general discussion of anxiety, to talk about something that we are seeing at alarmingly higher rates over the last couple of years, especially since COVID. And that is the topic of school refusal, sometimes also known as school avoidance. In the literature on the topic, it is typically referred to as school refusal. And it's important to define it because there is a subset of individuals who do not attend school that don't fall under this category. So when we are talking about school refusal, we are talking about these are kiddos that have difficulty going to school or staying in school, specifically because of reasons related to emotional distress. So I do want to clarify here, we are not talking about your kids that are like skipping school to go hang out in the bathroom with their friends, or I don't know, smoke weed behind the school or those kinds of things. These are kids who are actively avoiding school, and they are doing so because school has some kind of an emotional distress level tied to it. So just wanted to kind of make that clarification. It is most commonly associated with a primary diagnosis of anxiety, but it can also be present for individuals that are struggling with some kind of mood-related disorder as well. And I think it's also important to note here that there's kind of layers of complexity to school refusal, but a good chunk of these kids are going to be kids that also have diverse learning needs. Meaning, yes, they may be anxious about going to school, but the reason for their anxiety about attending school can span a large range of reasons. And many of those kids are going to have things like learning disabilities or attentional problems, and even like speech and language challenges, so kiddos that have a more difficult time communicating. All of those things make school more difficult for those kiddos, and presents the possibility that school can be kind of anxiety provoking for them. So when we're considering youth that are struggling with school refusal, we have to really, it's helpful to kind of dig down on our side from a clinical standpoint to, what's underlying the anxiety so that we can really target that component in treatment. But thinking about this from the parent lens, what does school refusal look like? And if there's any parents out there who are experiencing this, these items are probably going to resonate with you. So for these individuals, we tend to see really big temper tantrums in the morning, and refusing to leave home, not just for school, but especially for school. And those tantrums, I think sometimes when we use tantrums, we think about young children, but the reality is I have worked with a number of even early high school age individuals who are struggling with school refusal. And I mean, the tantrums, even at kind of that age, they're big. They can be pretty extreme. I love the term chandeliering. I as soon as she said that and described it, I thought, oh my goodness, that makes sense for a lot of these kids, because really that's what we see in the morning when it's to go to school. Some of these kids will make it to school, but then what's happening is they are, especially our older individuals who have cell phones, they are kind of blowing up mom or dad's cell phone saying, I need you to pick me up. My stomach is hurting. I can't be here. I can't do this. Will you come get me? And so they will make attempts to actually leave school once that anxiety increases. And for some of these kids, they may go to school. They're there, but then they're avoiding the classroom. So they're spending lots of time in the school nurse, usually for physical symptoms, which I have listed below, which is a huge presenting symptom for this population. In my own clinical experience, typically this presents in the form of GI symptoms, lots of stomach aches, and it's usually those stomach aches that are causing them to reach out and ask to go to the nurse or to ask for a parent to pick them up. So that's just a little bit of information kind of about what is school refusal, but it's critical to understand that it almost always in our populations that we're working with is related to some level of anxiety. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but Kearney and Spear have really kind of go with the name of the author, they've sort of spearheaded some of the research on school refusal. And I liked this chart that they have, which breaks down some of the contributors for school refusal. Some of these kids are actually, they're just simply trying to avoid something that makes them feel uncomfortable. And so when they avoid because they are anxious, it becomes reinforcing to them, okay? So for a kid whose parent picks them up from school because they're feeling anxious, that works out really well for them because now they're not having to face that uncomfortable situation. And then it reinforces that behavior. So for avoidance of negative affect and avoidance of social evaluation, it could be just because they feel anxious, or it could be because maybe they are anxious more about being evaluated in a social setting, having to speak out in public. Think more social anxiety kind of on that realm. But in both of those situations, it's the avoidance of that uncomfortable feeling that is actually reinforcing the behavior and then keeps them from being able to attend school. There is kind of a subsection here where refusing to attend school and not going happens because the opportunities positively reinforce them. So it could be that being home allows them to be with their parent or caregiver more, and then that in and of itself becomes more reinforcing, and so they're seeking that attention. And then when they get it, it just kind of keeps that pattern going. But also sometimes there are times where having access to tangible rewards when they aren't at school and they're able to go home and play video games, or hang out with friends. That's not usually happening because they're friends at school, hopefully. But or even getting to like sleep in later because they aren't being forced to go in the morning. All of those things can then be reinforcing in that situation. So there are a couple of different reasons, but what I'd really like to focus on, and really thinking about this from a family lens, especially if you're a parent or a clinician working with parents, is what do we do for these kids? And the reality is that I don't have stats to back this up, and maybe I should have pulled that, but in my clinical experience since COVID, I personally have seen rates of school refusal just at a level that I have not seen in my history as a clinician. I think what happened here is COVID happened and kiddos struggled with higher levels of social anxiety, separation anxiety, and going back to school presented as a big challenge for a lot of kids. And then on top of that, there was this kind of out that was presented for a lot of kids, which was virtual, right? And so prior to COVID, virtual schooling wasn't really a thing. And then all of a sudden, this opportunity to not have to go to school became an opportunity for families. And there's pros to that in some cases, but we're going to talk about how I feel that has really kind of created a very challenging cycle for our kids who are struggling with anxiety and school refusal. From an intervention standpoint, I'm not going to talk about what we do individually for these kids because Dr. Smith already covered that. as well as our first provider today. For these kids, when we're working with them one-on-one, we are typically using, CBT type strategies. And then school-wise, somebody else is going to cover school anxiety and things that the school can do on their end. But I'm going to focus more on what can the family do in these situations. And I'd like to emphasize here that there is a gear that is bigger than all of the other ones. And it is the family. We can work with a child individually in therapy on anxiety tools. And a school can be doing as much as they possibly can to try to help a child navigate anxiety in the school-based setting. But if the family is not on board with the process of reintroducing a child and exposing them to the feared stimulus, which is school and something related to school, if the family is not on board with that plan and process, treatment is really unlikely to be successful. I also want to highlight here that school refusal in almost every single case, it does not improve on its own. It absolutely requires intervention, and it really requires these three peers working together. But parents have to be on the same page with providers. So let's talk a little bit more about what that looks like. The term accommodation, and specifically family accommodation, some of this is pulled from actually Dr. Smith always lets me share her copy. I need to get my own. But this is out of Dr. Levitz's work talking about child anxiety and OCD. And I really like how he talks about family accommodation. What often happens when our kids, when we, as a parent, have a kiddo that is struggling with anxious tendencies, is that as parents, we often will make changes in our own behavior to try to help that child avoid or lessen those feelings of anxiety. And this is done from a place of love. It's done from a place of care. We love our kids and we want them to be happy, and we want them to feel safe and comfortable. But one of the struggles with family accommodation is that it can often reinforce the fear that the child has. And it's actually speaking life to them. It's almost telling them, you're right, that is scary. And so we're going to help keep you from that thing. And that's really not super helpful for kiddos who are struggling with anxiety. I have a list here. I'm not going to go through every one, but you guys can kind of read these on your own. But for example, a kid that is struggling with social anxiety, maybe it's they're, out with their family and they're getting ready to order. And, mom or dad says, oh, the waiter says, what would you like? And the child with social anxiety looks away. They avoid the waiter or waitress, and they just kind of shut down and they don't respond. Kind of naturally, this is where parents kind of accommodate for that. They kind of jump in, they order for their kid, they answer all the questions from the waiter or waitress. They've solved that problem for that kid, right? And that was helpful in that situation. But is that really helpful in the long run? Because what skill did that child gain or obtain through that process? Not a whole lot, right? And so what happens here with school avoidance, and I want you to kind of think about, okay, so what does family accommodation end up looking like in a school avoidance situation, school refusal situation? And this is where picking a kid up from school, allowing a kid to stay home from school, or giving the child the option to either be homeschooled or to use virtual schooling as an alternative. All of those things are examples of family accommodation. And at the end of the day, while those things aren't necessarily bad, I've got nothing against virtual schooling. I've got nothing against homeschooling. For a child that is not wanting to attend school because they're anxious, when we allow as parents that level of accommodation, there is no way for a child to work through that anxiety when they're not working through exposing themselves to abuse. And maybe that's an overly simplistic way of thinking about it, but from a parent standpoint and what to do in the home, we have to find ways to not accommodate these behaviors and help instill in our children that they can cope and they can move through these difficult feelings And so then we have to encourage them to use the skills and strategies that they're learning in therapy sessions and then take those to school and apply them. And we as parents have to be willing to set those boundaries for our kids and in a sense, not rescue them from the feared situation. So I kind of have already touched on this. So kind of what are some takeaways for this, parents? Again, we have to instill in our kids that they are capable. Sometimes this can sort of do a pendulum swing where we may be kind of dismissive of the feelings, right? Oh, you're fine. It's no big deal. You've got this, you know. This is a hard line, and I'm about to show a slide here that kind of touches on this, but the goal here is not to dismiss that the child feels anxious about attending school. It's to validate the feeling by helping your child label it and acknowledge that this is really, really hard. But being supportive rather than accommodating in that situation, okay? So I'm going to kind of jump over to my next slide just really quick. So what does this look like in practice as a parent, right? A non-supportive statement that is not incredibly helpful is just telling your kid, you know, you got nothing to be scared, or you're just fine, or you're just going to have to power through, suck it up, buttercup. You just got to learn how to handle hard things, and all of those things. I mean, they have a level of truth to them. However, they're not incredibly supportive, and they don't validate the experience the child is having in the situation. So I've provided a couple of examples here of like actual phrases that parents can use if their child is struggling with this. So it could be, I know that this feels scary for you, but I believe in you and I know you can. Or I know it's really hard right now, but when you go, you are going to be okay and you can move it. You know, you're right, anxiety is really uncomfortable. And that's what this is. This feeling is anxiety. But I believe in you and I know that you can handle it. And again, I'm talking about this through the lens of assuming that a child is most likely already involved in therapy and is learning coping strategies at the individual level to address these things. The parent role here is to be supportive, not accommodating, to encourage that child to face the feared stimulus, not provide an out. And to provide supportive statements to remind that child that they can cope and they have the tools that they can use to be successful in these situations. Unfortunately, what happens with accommodation, it provides that scapegoat, it provides that out, and all it does is reinforce the idea for that child that they actually can't cope with anxiety and that they need an intervention. I'm going to swing back just for a second and touch on healthy boundaries. Dr. Smith touched on this just a little bit ago, but what I'm talking about when I say not accommodating, that's a boundary, right? I know school is hard for you, but you have to go. Going to school is not an option. Not going to school is not an option. And presenting, I've worked with a lot of families struggling with this, and very, very quickly, the first thing that families often offer to their kid is, they ask the child this question, well, what do you want to do? Would you rather be homeschooled? And I get it. And that comes from a place of love and wanting your child to have choice. But what we see with kids with anxiety is more choice tends to equal more anxiety. With school refusal and school avoidance, we have to set a healthy boundary here about what has to be done in this situation. And so I would caution parents from taking that step of giving their child a whole lot of choice in this realm, because as soon as you give a kid that option, they're going to, if they are anxious, they are always going to go with the path of least resistance and the path that allows them to avoid things. So that's what I'm talking about when I talk about healthy boundaries and trying not to give too much choice in these situations. On the behavioral side, using rewards and consequences coupled with the strategies that we just talked about. I'm going to touch on that here in just a second. And then parents have to have some kind of communication with schools. This has to be a group-based, okay? I'm gonna slide through that. I just want parents to know you can use rewards and consequences appropriately with this, right? We wouldn't go to work if we didn't get paid. I mean, I love my job. It's awesome, but I get a paycheck at the end of the day. And so for kids that are facing the feared stimulus and they are going to school, we absolutely have to encourage them with behavioral stuff, with reward-based strategies, okay? 10:55, is that right? Okay, I'm gonna skim through real quick. Is that okay with you? We've got some resources at the end. Are you okay with me kind of segueing into this? Okay. Dr. Smith has a couple of resources at the end, and we may not necessarily have time to touch on those, but we'll kind of finish up by letting you guys take a peek at those, and they should be in your slides. I want to run through real quick just a brief case study of a kiddo that I worked with a very kind of highlights sort of what I've talked about today. This is a 9-year-old male struggling with both separation anxiety, which then kind of translated into school avoidance. Really quick background here. You guys can read some of this. I'm going to give the quick summary. This is prior to the kid coming to see me. K through 2nd grade. This was a kiddo who was previously enrolled in a private school setting, very, very low teacher to student ratio, really flexible, kind of followed that pattern of kind of child directed. I pulled a couple of quotes about the school environment, and it's very nurturing, very uniquely tailored, and very child-led. Okay, not bad things, but I think that's what this kiddo was really familiar with and used to. That plan changed for this family in August of 2021 when the kiddo started 3rd grade and began attending public school. During that time, the transition actually went relatively well. Started 3rd grade, was doing quite well. And then as we know, in March of 2021, so we may get all the way through 3rd grade, things are going great. Schools shut down for COVID, okay? Kiddo was placed into virtual schooling for the remainder of 3rd grade. Then finishes out the school year in August of 2021. The world starts kind of trying to piece itself back together. Public schools open up back up face-to-face. Kiddo is re-enrolled into face-to-face public school, does pretty well, goes home for Christmas or winter break, goes to return back to school in January of 2022, and all of a sudden starts experiencing this onset of really severe stomach aches at school. Starts having significant meltdowns in the mornings. Once at school, is having meltdowns about going to school, being at school. School staff are starting to call parents saying they can't get him calmed down. Eventually, what this pretty quickly turns into, as you can see, this starts in January and it ends in January. Parents start picking him up from school, taking him home. By end of January 2021, the 2022 kid is enrolled into a virtual learning academy. Stays virtual in November of 2022, comes to me for therapy, and separation anxiety has skyrocketed. Mom can't leave home because kid becomes so upset. We are no longer attending birthday parties. We don't go to friends' houses. We don't stay overnight with extended family members anymore. Families actually really frustrated about this because they want to see their grandkid, and he's unwilling to do those things. Highly, highly anxious. Still enrolled in virtual learning and comes to see me. Okay, and so from November, when I started seeing the patient, to January of 2023, we are focusing on things like building rapport, getting to know this kid. Extensive psychoeducation took place, talking about what is separation anxiety, what is school refusal, and what is the family role in treatment. I really tried to set the stage for the expectations here, talking about how family has to be on board or this is not going to be successful. To kind of keep it simple, a couple things I kind of wanted to highlight here for you guys. We started off in session by just simply working on the child being able to separate from the parent at this point. And we made a lot of progress in that, actually. At the individual level, we went from the kiddo parents couldn't even leave without the child having a panic attack, all the way to we were doing individual sessions and parents were actually leaving the office entirely. Made a lot of progress. Then we really started talking about school re-entry. Anxiety had been reduced. Mom makes this comment to me, if he feels ready, then I can. And I kind of wanted to highlight that here because that is a form of accommodation that puts everything in the child's boat. And really it needs to be, I believe he can do this. And so now I'm ready to help support him in that journey. But mom's wavering. She's wavering in her own comfort level here, and it puts it all on this kiddo. And that has a tendency to increase. And so we continue kind of working on CBT, working on kind of parent accommodation here. And eventually school finds out that virtual learning is no longer going to be a school funded option. And this kiddo has to go back to school. So we get him back into school in August of 2023. We had actually made great progress here. Parents do start to, we struggled, parents weren't always doing great exposures, but kind of told parents, hey, we got to set up exposures at home for him to be able to separate from you at home. Once they started doing that, we saw great progress. He was able to sleep in his own room again. I'm skimming over this so much, you guys, for lack of time. I'm sorry. But we get to a point where actually his anxiety has improved so much that he quotes, I actually almost forgot that I even have anxiety. He's excited about starting school back up for the first time in August of 2023. And he does it, and he does it relatively successfully. He reported a little bit of nervousness on that first week or two of school. Things were going well, and then all of a sudden, those stomach aches kind of started to creep in. And mom's automatic reaction here was to start picking him up from school. Those morning routines became really disrupted. He was refusing to comply, crying, stomach issues. From a therapy standpoint, strongly advised against parents removing him from school. We discussed how that was reinforcing the behavior. And unfortunately, by the middle of September of 2023, the kiddo was no longer attending school. He was placed in alternative online virtual schooling. He actually expressed great excitement about this and was pretty excited, I think, to have to not face the challenge. There were a lot of consults for GI issues. None of them have resulted in any kind of indication that there is a true underlying GI issue. And unfortunately, this is a family who hasn't returned for therapy. And this is not a success story. And part of that is because this is sort of the trajectory that I see often in clinical practice. And it's that families are often accommodating the anxiety, and unfortunately, not a lot of progress can be made when that's taking place. So my hope is that we can maybe get back on track, and that we can kind of work to kind of a new role there. We can make some progress should they choose to readdress those things. I'm not going to talk about these last two slides, but check out the schoolavoidance.org website. There's some incredibly great resources there for parents. And there's also some great resources there for clinicians as well, including an assessment scale, where if you have a child that's struggling with this, you can actually use the school refusal assessment scale to help maybe identify what the underlying cause of the school avoidance is, to help you narrow down treatment recommendations. So I hope today that I've highlighted the role of the family plays in some ways that parents can maybe help their kids work towards feeling supported, but not accommodating for their fear, to help them move forward in their treatment progress. So the next few slides that we have are coping tools for anxiety. So I think for time purposes, these are in your packet. There's just some different ideas to help support kids with anxiety. There's good examples of things parents can kind of lead kids to do at home to help. Some workbooks for kids, some books for parents, some websites, some apps. So all that's in your packet with the slide presentation. You can refer back to that as well. So sharing.
And before Rachel starts, I wanted to see if there's any questions from the group.
Rebecca, we do have one question in the chat box. In the case that you just reviewed, do you think that the parents played a primary role in the student's anxiety?
Absolutely, yes, I do. I think that parents and this is a complex answer, but I absolutely think parents were contributing to and also maintain the anxiety. Families were really struggling to see their child so distressed. And as a result, I think it also made them more anxious. And I think that anxiety kind of seeped in and sort of permeated. And they sort of modeled for the child as well, that, you know, if you have anxiety, you can avoid what you are having a hard time facing. And when we reinforce that behavior, it just makes it more difficult. So in the family, I just want to point out, the family was hearing this from multiple perspectives. Dr. Appleby referred him to me for testing, went through the whole deal, came to the same conclusions, had the same conversations with parents about, you know, there's not a reason for him not to be attending school other than anxiety about separating. Let's take steps. I also consulted with the school. We had a school-based plan put in place. We also were working on medication management for this kiddo, but again, this is an area where mom gave a lot of choice. He didn't like the taste, and he was we tried multiple options, and mom was like, well, if he doesn't want to take it, he doesn't want to take it. Again, there's a lot of choice, and I get like that autonomy and wanting to encourage kids to have a voice, but there's got to be a healthy balance and boundaries there.
And when I looked at the chat, they wanted to know what was the title of the book that you referenced?
I think you're talking about this one, and I hope maybe, but this is Breaking Free of Child Anxiety and OCD, and I highly recommend this book for parents. It is incredible. And if you go to the school avoidance link that I shared with you guys as well, they talk about space training, which is another treatment option for families that is actually developed by Lebowitz, correct? Yeah. By the author of this book, and it actually walks parents through the skills and strategies that kind of expand on what we talked about today. So we could do a 3-hour presentation on this one topic easily. So if it felt rushed, that's why.
Wonderful, thank you. And I put that in the chat as well, in case anybody needed to reference exactly the title of the book. Any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions yet. Some thank yous and some good stuff. So thank you guys for both taking the time to present. It was very helpful. Lots of positive comments. And so we'll go ahead and move on to Rachel.
Okay, sorry, my camera may not work. I've been having issues off and on. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me see.
Are you able to share your screen okay?
Yes, I can share my screen. I apologize if I don't have a camera. It worked yesterday when I tested it. So of course today, on the day that's most important, it's not going to work.
That is
But I'll just go
completely
ahead and at least share my screen. Okay.
perfect.
There we go. Okay, so thank you so much for the introduction. Again, many apologies surrounding the technology issue with my camera. I appreciate everyone's grace. So I want to emphasize the fact that while my presentation today is focused on teens, there will still be skills and information throughout that are very much suitable for elementary age friends. So bear that in mind. And I am in the essence of time, as well as in the essence of trying not to be repetitious from the presenters we've already listened to. I might skip through a few slides just to be mindful of that. So our objectives today are to hopefully delineate the difference between anxiety and stress, understand anxiety disorders and anxiety, emotion regulation, signs and symptoms of anxiety, building a positive classroom environment, and some coping tools and strategies. So, we want to really know the difference between stress and anxiety. While stress and anxiety do have those overlapping symptoms, like you'll see in the purple portion of the graphic, they do have different core components. Most notably, stress is caused by external forces, whereas anxiety is caused by internal forces. So, some folks might experience anxiety when feeling stressed, but they're not mutually exclusive, so they can live independently. And in some instances, stress can really act as a motivator for us to complete tasks, meet deadlines, engage in really challenging conversations, whereas anxiety is usually going to cause us to procrastinate or avoid because it has that fear component to it. Um, and also, stress and anxiety do tend to be short term, but with anxiety disorders, which I'll talk about here in a second, those that difference is going to be that those anxious feelings are existing for an ongoing period of time. So I might be stressed that I have a test coming up or that I have a deadline. I feel stressed about those tasks associated with that test or assignment or whatever the situation may be. And I might feel this pressure to make sure that I'm studying, to ensure that I'm prepared or doing the best that I can to make sure I have all the tools ready to meet that deadline or timeline. And so, using that same example, but with that anxiety lens, anxiety can cause me to feel fearful of failure or feel fear around disappointing caregivers or teachers or other adults that a student might respect or admire in their lives. And so, because I am feeling those fearful feelings and having those anxious thoughts of disappointment, I might then, as a result, procrastinate. I'm procrastinating on studying, procrastinating on anything to help me be prepared because I really want to avoid having to accept that I'm taking that test, having to accept that I'm needing to meet that deadline. And so I'm avoiding the potential failure that I believe exists. And so this is one that I'm going to kind of just like skim over. Like I talked about a second ago, you can have the presence of anxiety without it ever really shifting into that diagnosable anxiety disorder, right? Again, like stress, anxiety tends to be short lived. And when the disorder piece comes into play, it's when it's more persistent, it's when that worry is more excessive, and it's existing for you even in the absence of a threat. Um, so, one of the most noticeable differences between typical feelings of anxiety and those of an anxiety disorder is really that interference with instrumental activities of daily living. And that's kind of like what the presenters before were really talking about, where we're thinking about that school avoidance, maybe a disinterest in social opportunities or obligations, even adjustments in appetite or a decrease in appetite. And anxiety, like stress, like I said, it does tend to be more short lived and it's usually centered around something very specific, a specific worry, a specific concern. And then once that worry or concern has been worked through or moved on from, those anxious feelings do tend to subside. And so, what do we know? What do we know about anxiety and anxiety disorders? So, we know that anxiety disorders are the most common mental health condition for teens. You're likely to see symptoms of anxiety in early childhood, but something that I have experienced in the past professionally and even currently is that the behaviors or symptoms that we see in children tend to be misunderstood due to how those anxious feelings present with younger kiddos. And that's really because children don't have the same language as adults or their adolescent and teen counterparts. And so the anxious behaviors can really be observed as defiant or challenging behavior. So, what do we want to look out for? This graphic is really centered more towards teens, and we'll talk about childhood symptoms of anxiety in the next slide. So, don't think that I'm glazing over that. But again, this is a graphic really highlighting teen anxiety symptoms. And teen anxiety can look like excessive worry or fear, that restlessness, maybe the need to be constantly moving, bouncing my legs, tapping my fingers. Maybe you notice irritability, presenting sort of like mean or overly negative, or even having this overreaction that's not appropriate for the situation, right? That emotion is not fitting the facts. Sleep challenges, and that can be inability to fall asleep or stay asleep. And what you might notice in the classroom is that you're having students fall asleep, or they're presenting more tired in class than maybe normal. And we all have had students, I imagine, that have fallen asleep in class. And of course, that can be due to any number of reasons or causes, right? But if we're thinking through the lens of anxiety, that could be a potential reason why. And again, leaning back into that avoidance, right? Maybe school avoidance or social situation avoidance, that there's just lack of desire to engage in group activities, spend time with friends, or, engage in sports. And that's really what we're looking at then is we're looking for those changes. Maybe you have a student who's always been really outgoing. They've always been really good about engaging in group activities, having a lot of friends, and now all of a sudden you're observing this shift, or maybe you've observed this shift over a length of time, right? And you also might observe mood swings. And so I think listing off some of these symptoms is sometimes comical, because feedback that I have gotten from parents that I've worked with in the past is they're like, well, of course, they're mean. Of course, they're irritable. They're teenagers. That makes perfect sense. And I can completely agree. There are many of these symptoms that definitely align with natural teen development, right? But what we're really trying to do is create a character profile. Are those symptoms you're observing outside of the norm for that student? Are you noticing that maybe Chris sleeps a lot in class where typically he didn't do that before? And so you might kind of brush that off as like, well, maybe he's just feeling more tired, maybe he's taking on more things at home, et cetera, et cetera. But then you notice that he's also presenting more irritable, where you know him in the past to have a very relaxed attitude, and very go with the flow. Or maybe you notice that he seems to be easier to anger. So, kind of all of those behaviors compiled can give us cause for pause. Are those behaviors a symptom of something greater? Is something else going on here for this particular student? So, what this might look like in our younger kiddos, um, they might experience a lot of these same symptoms as their teen and adolescent counterparts, but you might observe more emotion driven responses. So, this might look like those tantrums or their meltdowns, maybe more tearful, or really having that constant need for reassurance from you. You may also hear them talk more about having an upset stomach, having headaches, that increased need to go to the bathroom or go to the nurse, that's really outside of what one might would consider normal for that age group. And then you also might notice that a child becomes more clingy, or they're needing a lot more comfort from you. And I know in working in elementary schools for myself in the past, comfort often looked like needing a hug or needing someone to sit next to them. And so, where they may have been a little bit more independent in the past, maybe they now need a lot more of that connection, whether it be physical or emotional. So, emotion regulation really consists of recognizing, managing, and then expressing those emotions. And the benefit of emotion regulation strategies is that they really do help students build resilience with the use of coping skills. And coping skills give folks ways to successfully cope when they're in the face of a challenge, when they're in the face of a really big emotion, or when they're experiencing dysregulation of any kind. And so resilience can also help provide protection for us, for younger folks, from experiencing low mood or having continued feelings or even the presence of anxiety or other mental health challenges that might could arise over the course of their lifetime. So here we have the cycle of emotion regulation. The cycle really begins with recognizing and naming the emotion. You may have heard the term name it to tame it. And that's really what we're doing here at the beginning. We're just trying to put a name to the emotion that we're experiencing. And so you may observe for your students the emotion that you're seeing from them. So when we're working with younger folks, you may need to state for them the facial expression that you're seeing, and reflect that back to them. Hey, I'm noticing that your eyebrows are closer together, that your mouth is turned down in a frown, and that your cheeks are really pink. Like, I'm wondering if you're feeling angry right now. Can you tell me what you're feeling? And sometimes, again, like I said a second ago, they may not have that language in those younger years to really be able to identify what that emotion looks like. So if you find that they are having a hard time verbalizing or identifying that emotion, it can be really helpful to show them a print off with facial expressions that lists the emotion on the bottom or next to it for that facial expression. And so those can are easy printables that you can find on Pinterest or on Google. Sometimes they are of actual human facial emotion, and sometimes it's those emoji emotions like we saw in the previous slide. And so that tool can be really helpful with students that have a hard time naming what's happening for them. And it's also really great if you have students in your classroom that are on the spectrum. So with teens, you might really more observe their body language for them and ask them more pointed questions. Like, I'm noticing that your arms are crossed and you don't want to look at me. It seems like you might be angry. Does that sound accurate? Am I on the right path? And if I'm not, can you share with me? Are you comfortable telling me what you're feeling so that I know how to support you and I can move along this process with you? And then that's going to move us into acceptance and validation, right? This is where we're going to help and support the student accept their emotion or emotions as normal, and we're going to validate the emotion. And something I want to say about this is I have worked in as a parent therapist in years prior, and oftentimes the hardest concept that I've discussed with adults is really that validation of emotion, and it kind of harkens back to, that need for you to just get over it and move on. And validation is important, right? Even us as adults, we like it when we feel seen, when we feel heard, when someone's like, yeah, that totally makes sense that you're upset by that. It makes sense that you're angry or that you're feeling sad. We like that as adults, right? And so we need that, and that same desire exists for teens, adolescents, and younger children. It makes them feel seen, it makes them feel heard. So that might look like, oh, I know it sounds like you're upset that you didn't get picked as a partner for partner work or for group work. It makes a lot of sense to me that you're feeling this way. So what can we do right now to be kind to ourselves? And this is kind of showing that you're being supportive, that you're willing to give them the grace for them to move through that emotion, which we'll talk about as the last piece of this cycle. And so it just really reinforces that support, reinforces that care, continues to build that connection and that relationship. So then we move into a place of curiosity. This is really an opportunity for us to encourage feelings exploration with our students using feeling centered questions. So, how did not getting picked make you feel? Well, it made me feel like I don't have friends, that no one likes me, and I'm all by myself. What a loser. And you can validate that, right? Yeah, I can understand how not getting picked made you feel all of those things. I think I would feel the same too. It makes sense. And then encourage them to check those facts, right? Okay, so I'm hearing what you're saying. That makes sense. That feels very real. I support that. Let's check the facts, right? Do we really not have any friends? Is that true? And provide them with concrete examples and observations that you have seen for that student as it relates to that statement specifically. So, I notice that you sit with folks at lunch and I see you laugh and joke, and sometimes you guys make trades with your lunch items. I also noticed that yesterday you were playing at recess in a group with some folks. Are those things that people do with each other if they're not friends or if they don't like you? And kind of encouraging them to have that opportunity to process that and reinforce for them what they're thinking is a thought distortion. That's not reality. Yes, you may not have gotten picked for this, but that doesn't equal that you don't have friends or that you're not liked. And so asking them how that emotion is making them feel can help them identify an appropriate coping tool for themselves. So maybe I'm feeling angry, and that means I need to engage in movement to get out those anger feelings or that tension. Or maybe I need to distract until I can regulate. And so you can really work with your students to identify appropriate coping tools that are going to work for them. Asking them, do you like to listen to music when you feel this way? Do you like to read? Do you like to be alone and sit quietly? And you guys can kind of collaborate to identify what works best. And maybe that's something that you can keep written down for the student so that you automatically know, okay, I'm recognizing that Heather is feeling this way. When she felt this way in the past, we knew that listening to music and sitting quietly were great coping tools for her. And so then offering that to her, hey, I'm noticing, I'm observing how that you're presenting X, Y, and Z. I know we talked about engaging in these coping tools in the past. Do you think you want to use some time to do that? So, for younger folks, it can be helpful to ask how that emotion is feeling in their body as well. Again, because they might have a hard time identifying what really is going on, what their core emotion is. So, you can help them describe and identify that emotion and say, like, okay, well, what does this feel like? How does this feel in your body? Well, it feels like something is really heavy on my chest, or I feel like I really need to run away right now, or I feel like I want to cry. And we can say, okay, well, that sounds like you're feeling angry. That sounds like you're feeling sad. And then they can kind of confirm or deny that for you. And you guys can kind of explore how that feels or what that emotion sounds like together. And then finally, moving into the last piece of the emotion regulation cycle, we want to move through the emotion and release it. We don't want to have to sit in that big emotion for too long. That can be really challenging. So you can explain that emotions are fluid, right? Explaining to them, hey, we all have big emotions all throughout the day, every day, and they come and they go. And it's okay that we have big feelings, but we don't want to sit in those big feelings forever, right? Because then that can kind of stop us from being productive. It can stop us from being a good friend or wanting to connect with our classmates, etc. So helping them again, engaging in a coping tool can really be supportive, and also giving them permission for them to let it go. Hey, it's okay for us to move through this. We accept we're feeling really sad right now. Let's go ahead and let's give this a try. Insert coping tool here, and let's see how we feel after that. And maybe we'll feel better enough to kind of move on throughout our day. So, your role in emotion regulation when it comes to the classroom environment, especially, is to be the thermostat, not the thermometer. So, you really want to set the temperature in your classroom. And of course, this could apply to sort of any profession within a school system or even a parent in your own home. You're wanting to set that temperature. It's easy for us to get escalated when our students or our kiddos are also escalated, when they're unable to calm down, when they're unable to regulate. But ultimately, what we're wanting to do as a thermostat is we're wanting to model the behavior that we want to see. It can be really hard. I want to validate and absolutely uplift that. It can be super hard not to be reactive or express non helpful emotions or feelings of frustration, especially in the school setting, right? You're always wearing wearing many hats, especially for teachers. You are attempting to manage many different things all at once. You have several students in your classrooms. You can have, 30, 35, 40 kids in that class. And when you're having to handle as one person all of your tasks and responsibilities, but also be mindful of all of the emotions of the students in your classroom, when all of that feels escalated, it's really challenging not to be reactive. And I want to give grace to you and encourage you to understand that you are also human. We talk a lot about how teachers and folks who work in schools are superheroes. And I think that can sometimes put a lot of pressure on us to not have normal human emotion or feelings. And I want to say that it's okay for you to not be all the things all the time. And it's okay for sometimes you to take that superhero cape off, right? Ultimately, students are more likely to respond to the environment or the temperature, if you will, when they're experiencing dysregulation. So, if you can find ways to bring yourself back to your baseline once you start to notice you're feeling overwhelmed or you're feeling frustrated, I want to encourage you to engage in whatever way feels good or works for you to reset your thermostat, right? And sometimes that might mean you saying, hey, you know what, guys, I'm going to have to take a break for a second. And I know that that can be very risky to leave the classroom, but maybe that means just standing outside the classroom for a minute, taking some deep breaths for yourself, and then coming back into the situation. So, creating a positive classroom is really integral to supporting students' emotions. And a lot of this, of course, are things that I would imagine most teachers or most people who are working in the school environment are already doing. Um, but it's also hard sometimes because we might feel stuck in some of these spaces. How can I do these things? What should I be doing? How can I make my relationships a little bit better? So that's really what we're talking about when we're talking about creating a positive classroom. So engaging in building positive relationships with students is really important piece of the puzzle. I think it's safe to say that most teachers have an interest in or have positive relationships already with their students, and still sometimes we can feel stuck or we can feel unsure of how to continue to build those relationships or strengthen those relationships most effectively. And what we know is that positive student teacher relationships are really the number one determinant for academic success. And when you think about it makes a lot of sense, right? Students spend most of their days and most of their time in any given day at school. And so having that one positive relationship with a trusting adult that can facilitate that emotional openness, can facilitate that vulnerability, which can then lead to easier conflict and classroom management is really important. So students with positive teacher relationships, they want to perform better just naturally because they want you to be proud of them, they want your approval, they want that external praise and validation that they get from you when they do well, and then that continues to provide that internal motivation for themselves. And so that feeling of connection really fosters emotion regulation. It fosters that independence and resiliency that we want to see in our students, especially as they get older and they move into their teen years and their high school years. Having that independence and that resiliency is really powerful. And it allows you as well to have respectable limits and boundaries with your students. They're more likely to have interest in following instruction. They're more likely to have interest in respecting where you are on certain rules in your classroom, etc. And so building those relationships can really include a varying number of things. It can include creating a unique handshake together. I learned about a lot of these relationship building techniques in a play therapy training that I went to, and I walked away feeling really good about that because these are extremely attainable fairly easy techniques to build relationship without you having to have these really long, deep, intimate conversations, because a lot of students are not going to walk into a classroom, ready to be best friends, but they might be willing to have more conversation with you if they're engaging in any one of these unique techniques. I apologize if you're hearing the announcements happening right now. I don't have control over those, so I hope it's not too distracting. So, those unique techniques might be engaging in a handshake that is specific between you and that student. And I want to reinforce that if you do choose to do something like a handshake, that it does need to be individual for each student. I absolutely understand how that can be very overwhelming. So, am supportive of you kind of utilizing that tool in whatever way really works best for you. Creating a fun saying or a buzzword to use when you see each other. Maybe you see each other in the hallway and you have a shared interest or you like the same movie. I know, for instance, like I have a student who really resonates with Iron Man. He refers to himself as Iron Man often. And so sometimes when I see him, I'll say, hey, like, hey, Iron Man, how's it going? And I think that just lets him know I see you, I'm here for you, and you're always welcome to come talk to me. Even making funny faces to your students, whether that's in the classroom or in the hallway, it's kind of encouraging that laughter. It shows your willingness even to be vulnerable. So it shows, like, I can be silly in front of you, which is embarrassing. And I don't mind being embarrassing because I'm being embarrassing for you. And so if I can do this in front of you, you can be vulnerable with me. Integrating regular positive activities. This can really look like taking short breaks of movement, like stretching or walking. Or even jumping jacks. I know sometimes these movements can be really challenging for elementary age kids because they get a little bit overly excited and then it kind of turns into a three-ring circus. But engaging in that movement and that excitement can be really helpful. Engaging in random classroom breaks or games, sorry. I know I've seen this a lot at the elementary age. They take brain breaks and they'll play little games quickly. But we don't see that as much in the high school level, and even not as much in middle school, or even allowing for a social break, right? A social break can be really great, especially with teens. And that might look like giving them permission to use their phone for 10 minutes. I know a lot of teachers require students to put their phones away, whether it be in a phone caddy or in a basket, whatever that looks like. So, giving them permission to utilize their phone for 10 minutes, allowing them to connect with their neighbor or a friend. And you can put parameters around that, right? Hey, I'm going to give y'all a social break. You have 10 minutes. You can only talk to someone who's sitting next to you, in front of you, or behind you. We're not getting up and walking around. Because, like adults, children of all ages also need breaks. Having those brain breaks really give us that opportunity to reset. I know sometimes when I'm feeling overwhelmed at work or I feel like I have too much going on, I feel like, okay, I really need to take myself on a walk. And it really helps to increase mood, foster relationships amongst other students in the classroom, etc. And then lastly, encouraging student voice and participation when possible and appropriate, which I imagine most teachers again are doing. And this provides an authentic opportunity for students to be involved with each other. It helps them build community within their classroom, helps them to be active in class, allows for expressions of diverse thought, which is really great for complex thinking. And so this encouragement with teens is often best when they're able to make their own choices about when to participate, or when the standard is already set surrounding student participation. So maybe that's a standard that you set in your classroom at the beginning of the year. Requiring students to answer a question on the spot or express themselves in front of a classroom can cause feelings of anxiety. I know that there is a lot of sort of like pop questions that can happen at times, and students oftentimes feel stunted and they don't know what to say. And then they feel these feelings of embarrassment, and it kind of makes them want to withdraw, and it makes them less likely to want to engage in answering questions or speaking, right? So, just something to be mindful of. And we want to create a safe space for our students to participate, right? So this can look like setting up community guidelines, expectations that all the students in your classroom are to uphold. And these guidelines should, of course, have teacher input because ultimately you are the one who is guiding that classroom. You're the leader of that, right? But we want it to be very much student driven. If it's student driven, they're more likely to be respecting of those guidelines. So, lastly, we are going to move into strategies and tools. So, as we touched on earlier, encourage students to really accept their emotions. Like, emotion acceptance is really hard, oftentimes, for younger folks. And a lot of that is around shame, it's around embarrassment. Maybe it's comes from a place of adults in their life not allowing them to have emotions and sort of brushing them off and making it seem like that's too much emotion for the situation, right? So really continuing to encourage and be supportive of that emotional acceptance, and really reminding them, right, that there is no good or bad emotion. Emotions just are. There's no positive or negative emotions. Emotions just exist for us, right? And so you may find that students, like I said, experience those feelings of embarrassment or shame around emotions or emotion expression. And so encouraging them to accept all of their emotions and explain, we all have them. Hey, I'm fully grown adult and there are times where I have really big emotions and I have to accept that so I can move through that because otherwise I'll kind of sit in that feeling all day. And I notice when I do that, I'm not productive in my job. I'm easier to anger. I am not productive when I get home from work because I can't move past that, right? So emotions serve a purpose. It's simply information for us, and it's okay for those to exist in our space. Something that can be really helpful is offering mantras to your students. So, this can look like, and I've used this myself with students that I work with, helping them recognize, and I always say, encourage them to sit up straight and put their palms on the tops of their thighs or have some sort of physical connection with themselves. Maybe that's putting their hand on their chest, whatever. And so having them say to themselves, this emotion is uncomfortable for me. This does not feel good for me. I'm feeling sad right now. And I accept that that's where I am. And it is what it is. Right. And letting them kind of sit in that acceptance. And also, another thing that you can do is encourage them to even tell themselves, if this is the worst part of my day, right? Going back to an earlier example, if the worst part of my day is that I didn't get picked for a group project, I'm going to be okay, right? Because I'm still going to be able to have friendships outside of this one experience. I'm still going to be able to have caregivers that love me and care for me, right? So if this is the worst part of my day, I'm going to be okay. And this really does show students that it is okay to have those big emotions, and it reinforces for them that these emotions don't last forever. Sometimes we'll notice, or I notice that, students or young folks feel like, well, this is going to be like this for always. This is never going to get better. And, is that true? Can you remember a time in the past when you felt really sad or when you felt really angry or, insert big emotion here? And, do you still feel that way? Have you felt that way every day since then? Okay, so then we know, right? We checked the facts. Big emotions don't last forever. Engaging in distraction can be really helpful. It can help students identify a healthy way for them to cope. And this is, of course, something that you both will agree on, right? It's a conversation that's going to happen between the two of you, and you're going to have equal parts in this, right? You're going to go ahead and help them to understand we're going to set limits on distraction time in the classroom because we just can't spend all day engaging in distraction because then we really wouldn't get anything done. So you can kind of discern what that time limit looks like, and then explain that together you'll reassess how you feel after maybe 10 minutes. Let's say 10 minutes is your distraction time that you're allowing for that student or that y'all have agreed upon, right? Okay, well, after 10 minutes, we'll come back together. And if you're still feeling dysregulated, then we can kind of reassess what happens next, right? And that can be whatever amount of time that you agree to, or whatever compromise y'all get to. And if they feel like they need more distraction time, then that's another conversation that y'all can visit together. So encouraging distraction can really help younger folks from engaging in impulsive behaviors or actions, especially with teens and adolescents. Oftentimes we notice that when they feel big feelings, they engage in really impulsive behaviors in one way or another. And so, helping them engage in distraction gives time for it to pause before they engage in that distraction. Um, it also gives them time to reach back down to their baseline, or at least get closer to their baseline, and teaches them that you can always come back to that feeling, right? You can always come back to that emotion or that problem. It's kind of like conflict. Not every conflict has to be solved in that exact moment. It's okay for us to take breaks and then circle back to that, right? And we want to have a really laissez faire attitude around distraction, taking the pressure off. And so, if this works, that's great. And if not, then we'll come back to the drawing board and find out what does work for you together. Um, and you can say, okay, I hear you need more time. Let's say you have a dysregulated student, they've engaged in distraction for the amount of time that you've allotted, but they come back and they say, you know, I was at a 10. Maybe you engage in a temperature check. I was at a 10. I'm now at a 5. Okay, so I hear you need more time. It sounds like you were able to get closer to baseline, right? Or however you want to term that. I'm wondering if maybe you could engage in another distraction, or if you want to continue to engage in the distraction you did before. What do we think is a fair time for us to agree on, right? And they might say, well, I want 20 minutes. And you can bargain with them and say, hey, 20 minutes feels like a really long time. Can we maybe find a middle ground for that? Maybe another 10 minutes, or maybe another 5. And if you can set that agreement to agree on that together, then you can also encourage them to try to engage in whatever it is that maybe they were working on or doing before. So, okay, we've agreed that you're going to get 10 more minutes of distraction time. So, can you bargain with me and let's trade, right? If you give me 5 minutes of work time, then I'll give you 10 minutes of more distraction time, and being respectful of that distraction, right? Not engaging with the student during that protected time, because we want to create a system and stick with it so that it shows um, the student that you're being respectful of their boundaries, just like you want them to be respectful of yours. And finally, teaching your students some relaxation techniques. These techniques can include box breathing. What I like to do for this with students is I like them to put their finger on their leg, or in a place that feels not too vulnerable for them, like where it can be seen by others, but put their feeling on their leg, or their finger on their leg, and then kind of create that box, right? So, breathing in for 4, holding for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4, and kind of encouraging them to do that, and even talking themselves through it, so that that way they can help themselves regulate and give them that time. Also, using the 3-3-3 rule is really fun. I know there's a 5-4-3-2-1 rule as well, but I find that can be really difficult to do in the classroom. It's hard for students to be really mindful or aware of that opportunity. So that's 3 objects you can see, 3 objects you can hear, and 3 body parts you can move, right? So maybe this is like moving their leg, moving their toes in their shoes, wiggling their fingers. It's really small, mindful movements. And then practicing visualization. Have students close their eyes and visualize their favorite place, or a place that feels good or holds a fond memory for them. Um, and this can be a technique that you use as a classroom. If you notice that your classroom is acting extra out of pocket that day, you might say, like, okay, we need to pause and I want us to go ahead and take a trip. And maybe that visualization is something that you want to come up with. I get the beach a lot, and so you might turn down the lights, play some calming music, maybe play some waves in the background, and say to them, okay, we're going to close our eyes, we're going to put our hand on our chest, we're going to do some deep breathing, and we're visiting the beach today. Can you feel the sand in your toes? Can you hear the seagulls in the background? Can you hear the waves crashing? Do you feel the sun on your face? Can you smell the salty sea air? Getting really descriptive to help them really lean into that visualization. And then um, finally, setting a hand on your chest or over your heart while engaging in slow, steady, deep breathing. This allows for you to feel your heartbeat slow, which can provide comfort because it's a physical reminder that I am calming down. And that practice really encourages mindfulness around your breathing. I also encourage people to place their hand on their belly, which can be a little bit less obvious. And then still paying attention to the feeling of your belly moving in and out, the same way that you're feeling your heart rate in your chest with your hand, right? But it's just simply more discreet. So, practicing relaxation exercises with students can really support them in anxiety management and can support you in anxiety management. And it helps to facilitate calming down when feeling overly anxious or dysregulated. And that is all. Thank you so much. And again, I really apologize for not having a camera. I'm just having some technical difficulties with that, but I appreciate your patience and grace.
Thank you, Rachel, for the wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it. And I want to also thank Dr. Appleby, Dr. Smith, also for your presentation today. This has been very helpful and certainly given everybody some things to think about and some tools to bring back to their practices. So I want to take a few minutes to allow anybody that may have any questions to either put that in the chat, or you can raise your hand so we can unmute you and we'll give you an opportunity to ask Dr. Appleby, Dr. Smith, or Rachel any questions. And I believe there's one in the chat already, which is, Rachel, what is the activity of play therapy?
Um, I was saying that I learned those techniques from play therapy. So the handshakes that I was talking about, the sort of like buzzword that you might say to each other in the hallway or with each other, and then also making silly faces. So those were some practices that I learned at a play therapy training that I went to that I thought was really beneficial for me.
Wonderful. Thanks for that clarification. Anybody else have any questions? I know we're getting some thank yous in the chat box, but anybody have any additional questions for past speakers?
I'm sorry, one thing I did want to say really quick in response to the play therapy, just because I think if that's what you're interested in or you want to know more skills, there is a group called Empathy Well. They are located in the North Texas area, and Dr. D. Ray is their head clinician there, and she is also a professor at UNT in their Center for Play Therapy, and she offers a specific training called Supporting Challenging Behavior and Connecting with Hard to Reach Students, the Playful Education Way. So if you just look up Empathy Well or Dr. D. Ray, you might find that that will take you to a place that can be really helpful in learning more play therapy skills or techniques to integrate into your room.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, Dr. Ray is definitely well versed in play therapy. So lots of thank yous. Really appreciate our presenters so far. And so see if there's any more questions before we move on to Dr. Lisa Pierce.
Rebecca, there's a question in the Q&A.
Let me pull that. It's going through all my links.
I can call it out. It says, how do you help parents handle or differentiate when kiddos are calling to come home, visiting the nurse, etc., due to stomach aches or headaches?
Is that a question for me?
It
Or
doesn't,
anyone. I just wasn't sure. I didn't want to not answer if that's who you were looking for.
maybe both, maybe it'd be good to have you both have the opportunity to answer it. I know Dr. Smith, looks like you have a response too.
Oh, yes, please go ahead.
I wasn't sure who it was directed to, so I was like, well, let me jump back on just in case. I mean, I would say from my perspective, looking for patterns in that, if it's happening habitually, we're like, okay, there may be something else going on here. In that case, you would still want to visit the doctor. Let's rule out any medical stuff because there can be legitimate, IBS, other GI issues, other migraines, headache issues that are legitimately happening. But also in almost all cases I've seen, even if there is a medical complication, it's being compounded with anxiety also. So it's still great to work on the anxiety piece because that can help a lot of times those somatic symptoms as well. So I don't know if Rachel has a different, more to add to that from being in the school.
No, I definitely think that that's exactly what I would have said myself. So I appreciate that.
Thank you both. And there's another question with what character traits do you look for in parents or attempt to help parents develop the need to support their kids attending school?
So I would say as far as character traits, the kiddos that tend to have school avoidance also tend to have anxious parents. So really working with parents to help them check their emotions. And even if they are feeling anxiety about their kid going to school, saying, I know this is what's best for them. There's no reason for them not to be at school. So just really working on, self-regulation skills and just projecting some confidence to those kids to help motivate them and encourage them rather than, oh my gosh, I think you can do it, because that's not going to be helpful for anybody. And it's just modeling, more of a struggle. Yeah.
Wonderful. I think there is no more questions in the Q&A. Okay. Well, thank you both, or all of you guys, Dr. Smith, Dr. Appleby, and Rachel for presenting. I'm going to do our next introduction of our next speaker. Dr. Lisa Pierce is a solo private psychiatrist in practice for over 27 years. Her practice is centered around the treatment of mood disorders, autism, and ADHD in children, adolescents, and adults. The essence of her practice is personalization. She spends time with each client, getting to know them and listening at length to understand their unique situation. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Pierce.
Happy to be here. So I am going to attempt, wonderful. I wasn't able to join all of the conference, but it sounds like there have been wonderful ways that you have talked to people about how to help our patients and our educators and the parents. And so I am tasked with trying to offer up some opportunities to take good care of ourselves. I've been tasked with, looking at the provider burnout. And so when I first saw this, I thought, yes, of course there's mental health provider burnout. So, oh, good, somebody's doing that for me. Or maybe, yay, did somebody share my screen? Thank you. So, so part of the issue, I think, is that it felt like in March of 2020, everything happened, everything stopped, and we came back from that really having so many more patients. And I mean, I know that's been my experience and those colleagues that I work with, but I kind of did this deep dive. And so I wanted to talk about first defining what burnout was, what contributes to it, what are some of the statistics, how do we know when we're having it, and then how can we help each other.
And Dr. Pierce, I'm not seeing a screen share.
Okay, let me try again. Hold
Okay.
on. Okay, guys, and this is when being 58 is not helpful. Okay, let me try a screen
Yeah,
share.
it's always tricky. Don't worry.
Okay, I think that's it. So I'll share it, and then let me see if I can get it into.
That is perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
If you want to click on that, yep,
Yeah.
that's great. Looks
Okay. We've got it. Yay. Okay. So, and I don't even know what slide this is. So sorry. So this is good. This is where we are. I really wanted to talk about actually more the definition. Let me see if I can go back. Is that going back or forwards? I'm so sorry. I want to go forward. Let me back out of this for a second. well, you know what? We're just going to go where we are. So I really wanted to define, and hopefully you all got the packet and you don't have to rely on my tech skills, but really I wanted to define what provider burnout was, or what just burnout in general was. And it's psychologically a syndrome. It's characterized by emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and this kind of decreased sense of personal accomplishment, which I think over the last several years, we have probably all experienced. But more importantly, I want to talk about what the factors were that contributed to burnout. It would seem, as I stated before, that burnout really started substantially in March of 2020, but really it's a 60-year-old problem. It's been going on for many, many years, and probably in the last 15 or 20 years with cuts in budgets and funding for mental health, it's just exacerbated the issue. And so by the time we got to 2020, we were really in a bit of a crisis and really kind of ill prepared to deal with the aftermath of that particular crisis. In 2016, the Health and Human Services felt like that we needed an additional 250,000 mental health care providers by 2025. That's next year. So obviously we have not been able to do that. And, the thought was initially, where 1 in 10 Americans were experiencing depression and anxiety, by the time we got to 2021, 4 in 10 Americans and children in particular, were experiencing anxiety and depression. And we really probably seen that number is probably not even accurate. We're seeing more of that today. So, what contributes? Mainly diminishing boundaries for mental health providers. We want to help the folks that we want to help. So we take fuller caseloads, we have extended hours. We're doing all these things to help people and sometimes not taking good care of ourselves. So because there's less time for self-care. So, what does it look like in terms of the statistics? Before COVID, probably 2 in 5 mental health providers said that they were experiencing burnout, as I described previously. So, okay, we're to the statistics. And by the time we got to the post-pandemic era, we're looking at 60 to 70% of people are experiencing that piece of not feeling like you're accomplishing enough. There's not enough hours in the day. You're not able to take as good a care of yourself as you would like to. And so what does that look like? How do we know that we are experiencing burnout or vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue? Those are all the things that we call it. We're physically and mentally exhausted. By the emotional demands of the people that we're trying to take care of, by their traumatic experiences, and it's happening over a period of time, and it's unremitting. And what it leads to in terms of being a practitioner is we just are not able to express our compassion to others. We can kind of become cynical, and it leads to burnout in not able to help our patients as we'd like to. So what is the emotional exhaustion? It's emotional fatigue, I think, is different for everybody. It could be sadness or anxiety. It could be irritability. Just lack of motivation, not being able to enjoy any aspect of what you do. It's maybe not being able to stay focused on the clients that you take care of. What does it look like personally? You're not sleeping as well. Maybe you're not eating as well. Maybe you're overeating, headaches, all the things that we talked about in terms of anxiety and depression with our patients are now happening to us. And we have to be able to recognize that. But what happens ultimately is that our personal or professional relationships become negatively impacted. I mean, we aren't able to take as good a care of patients as we'd like. Maybe we're not calling back people who refer to us or collaborating in the way that we've done in the past. This concept of depersonalization, I mean, I think we all have an understanding of what that is, but really it's just this detachment from what we're doing. It's a detachment from our patients. We kind of have maybe a callous perception. I mean, and on any given day, certainly we can all have challenging patients that will take you to a place where you're frustrated with your inability to help them because you're working harder than them. But this is more of a pervasive type of construct where it's not just a particular patient that is challenging, but it feels like all patients have become this challenging patient. And again, it can lead to anxiety, depression, all of those things that we sort of talk about with our patients. And I think probably what most of us have experienced is just this, one, I think that our patients are more challenging than they have been, for me anyway, in the last 20 years, especially in the last 4 years. I think there's just so much anxiety. I've never seen this much anxiety in my practice, not ever, not ever. And, the school avoidance, the school phobia, people, I have a lot of patients who will say the pandemic was the best thing that ever happened. They've been practicing all their life for it, and trying to re-enter the world post-pandemic was really frightening for them. And especially for those kiddos who came back to, maybe the young ones who came back to not really knowing what school was supposed to be like in the first place, to a very different operating way that it worked. And so, we then are trying to help people who have more challenging problems, and we're just not able to help them as quickly. We can't get people into our practice. In my case, I can't get them in, and I have a hard time referring out for the therapy aspect of it, because certainly it's not just about medications. So all that begins to kind of create a burden for us. So I'm going to move my hold, please. Let's see if I can move this over here. So, one of the ways I think, and I probably should have put this in before, we'll do an exercise at the end so you can kind of know, what's going on and how do you know if you're experiencing burnout. But, what are the ways that we can prevent it? How do we intervene? What are the symptoms that are present? And I would say that on any given week or month, anybody can experience burnout. It doesn't have to be this kind of irreversible. It's not that it's inevitable, but it's certainly treatable and reversible, but you have to know that you're experiencing it. So, I always use the statement that, put your oxygen mask on yourself first, and then you can take good care of other people around you. We've got to know what our boundaries are. We've got to know, and we've got to respect those. And, no is a real word. And sometimes we just aren't able to take on another client, or we're not able to stay the extra hour or two or add another day. But we've got to be able to check in with ourselves, to check to see how we're doing outside of our group practice or our individual practice, so we can then take good care of the people that are there. So that you're temporarily checking in. Do you need to just cut back hours, even if it's just for a week? Are you canceling things that you used to enjoy doing because you don't have the opportunity, or you don't have the fuel to continue to participate in those things because you're so busy at work? And so, I think that each time that we are going into work, my every day I go in and say, okay, is today the day that I'm just going to retire and start naming psychiatric medicines? That's kind of the thing that I say. Or, how am I really feeling, and where do I need to cut back, and where can I cut back if I need to? Do I need to take a vacation? The answer is always there, yes. So, I think that self-care gets to be a super important part of this thing that we're doing. And what does self-care look like? I mean, I think that's different for everyone. I box, so I have I exercise 3 times a week, but like the favorite thing I have in the whole week is that I do a boxing class, because it's an outlet for frustrations. It helps me sleep better at night. I do it with a group of ladies that I've done this with for several years. And so I have this opportunity to do it, outside of my normal routine. And it's something that is just for me, that is independent of my practice. It doesn't have we don't talk about my practice. We don't talk about their work schedules. It's just a time for us. But the other thing I think that is really, really important for all of us is we have to seek out a community of support within our group, because there's nothing like talking to other providers who are experiencing some of what you're experiencing. And, what are they doing? How are they taking care of themselves? I'm in a solo private practice. And so I have a group of friends who are therapists, friends who are psychiatrists, who are in the biz, educators, and they're my community support. We can bounce things off of each other. I would say that if you're in a group practice, if you're with other people, check in on your colleagues to see how they're doing. If you notice that they seem a little lethargic, fatigued, check in with them, go have a lunch with them. We can help take care of each other. So part of it is take care of yourself, recognize when you're having issues with setting limits, having appropriate boundaries, and that kind of thing. Also check to see if that is happening with someone else. So I'm going through this quickly. I'm sorry I'm talking so quickly. So the other thing is, I should have done this at the very beginning, and I will tell you that I Susie Gagne at the Advocacy Center gave this to me, and it's just a quick self-test. And so if we pretend that we have Monopoly money on the tables, because this was supposed to be sort of a group exercise, and you get to take $1 for everything that you're doing on this list. So we talked about that when we're doing good self-care, we're sleeping. I don't know that I've slept a full 8 hours a night since I was in residency, but certainly more than 5 or 6 hours a night, that you're really sleeping, that you wake up feeling restored and well rested. You know, are you eating? Are you rushing to get to work because you're going to see that extra patient early so you don't eat breakfast? Are you skipping lunch because you have all these phone calls to do? In my case, I'm taking care of prescriptions. You know, are you eating a well-balanced breakfast? Are you eating lunch? Are you eating? Are you getting up and taking bathroom breaks? Are you hydrating? All those kinds of things that your body really needs you to do. And exercising regularly is just, again, an outlet. It doesn't have to be that you're training for some marathon or that, you know, to be in something in the Olympics, but that you are doing something physical with your body, even if it's just to walk outside when it's nice during the lunch hour, to go to your car to drop something else and then come back, or to check the mail. Or in my case, my bathroom in my building is a million miles away. So walking there is an opportunity for me to get up, stretch my legs, check in on how I'm doing. Am I talking to friends? Or am I just coming home and turtling? Am I bringing work home and doing that and just not doing other things that are going to be good for myself? Because you've got to give yourself permission to take good care of yourself. And so if you're doing these things that are on this list, you are participating in some spiritual or religious practice, any form of it, meditation. If you're still engaging in your hobby and your pastime that you enjoy, and at the end of it, you feel relaxed and not necessarily burdened by it, all of these things would say that you get $1. So some of us may have a lot of money right now because we're doing all the things that we're supposed to be doing. Some of us may not have been able to collect anything. So the other part of the quiz is really to sort of take away the $1 if you weren't doing those things. And I guess I say all this to say, this is a slippery slope. It's sort of a burnout is a slow and insidious process. You don't sort of wake up one day and you can wake up one day and just be fed out, but it's something that kind of happens gradually. You might not necessarily recognize that it's happening. You might not recognize that your sleep has deteriorated a little bit, or that you don't wake up feeling restored. You might not recognize that almost every day you skip lunch, or you eat something like a bag of chips, or, you know, drink a cup of coffee and that's what you have. You might not even recognize that you're bringing work home, especially if you don't physically bring like charts or something home, but that you're not able to compartmentalize at least a little bit and leave your work where it is, and not, you know, think about, you know, there are cases we're going to have and we're going to think about. That's just part of it. But that is more of an abnormal situation, that we have enough going on outside of our work environment that we can leave it there to deal with it the next day, if that is possible. You know, the other thing I think that is really the slow and insidious part is we can often become very isolated from our support systems. It can be, you can be isolated from your friends and your family. Maybe if you're with a group practice, maybe there was a time when you always met once a week or once every other week where you went to lunch and you kind of talked about things, and you find yourself not really engaged in that and not making the time to do that. Maybe, again, you're not going to do your workout or exercising. You're not really engaging with your family, that you're just always really too tired. And I think that the really slippery part is not recognizing if you're using, you know, alcohol or other substances to kind of just help you get through the day. And we've all been tired where we've needed the extra cup of coffee to kind of push through the morning. But it's more than just the occasional using that. It's more than just, I had a glass of wine last night after dinner, but it becomes the thing that you have to do to fall asleep at night. And then again, it's neglecting all the other things that are important, that take care of your emotional needs, because you just don't have enough alone time or downtime in the week to do it. And so, you know, the result ends up that you aren't doing those things. Here we go. And if we were doing this exercise in person, I would say, okay, does anyone have any money? Do you need a loan? How are you taking care of yourself? And I would almost encourage that checklist, that we do that, maybe once a week to see how we're doing. I mean, some weeks are going to be better than others. And if that it is a case where we're kind of checking a lot of the boxes on the, hey, we're leading to burnout, what are the other things that we can do for self-care? How do we utilize our community of support? Who is our community of support? I mean, it's hard. I always tell my patients that, you have to know who your support system is before before you actually need to use it. In the middle of the crisis or the time of extreme frustration, that's not the time that you want to be looking for that community of support. You want to sort of have that in process before you get to this point. And I think all of us who are in this business, in this space right now with mental health, need to sort of have our community of support already in place. We have to have an awareness that we need to be tuned into our needs, our limits, our emotions. And we have to accept what we can and cannot do. We're not able to offer all things to all people all the time. There has to be a balance between work and rest and play. I mean, we do get to have fun if we have time for it, hopefully. And as far as the connection, I think is probably one of the most important things, because it's very easy to become isolated when we're in the throes of trying to help everybody else and we feel depleted. You don't feel like you want to connect with other people because you don't have anything to offer. Sometimes just sitting in the room with one of your colleagues will be enough. And so, trying to maintain those supportive relationships that you've already identified as your community of support, talking about what's going on, that it is challenging, that these cases are becoming more challenging, that you feel depleted. I mean, we've got to be honest with ourselves. And, I think sometimes that can be as intense as doing some of the things we talked about, self-help, the exercise, the being with other people, but it may need to go up a level. And there's no shame in that, in having your own mental health provider, if you can find one, that can help you through what may have become a more challenging time, and you need more help than just those kind of self-care items. And so I did go through this very quickly, but I guess, as I was preparing for this, what I really wanted people to kind of, the take-home message is that we probably have all experienced this in some capacity. It may not be prolonged, it may not be persistent, but I would say that certainly in the last 4 years, things have changed. The fabric of the need for mental health providers has changed. There are not enough of us, it would seem, for all the people who are really struggling. And in order for us to take very good care of them, we have to remember to take good care of ourselves. So that's what I have. Thank you.
What a great message and a reminder for all of us, for sure. Thank you. And I wanted to thank everybody for presenting today, and giving the time to really kind of educate us on this, wonderful topic, and how to better support our community and our students, our families, and ourselves. So thank you guys all for joining us, and thank you for those that are spending their time to learn and to equip themselves to be better prepared. So we appreciate everybody for joining us.